Chapter 28 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. An increased sallowness and a slight thinning of the hair were the only changes that might have been noticed in Parker Steele that spring. The characteristic symptoms had been slight and evanescent, the rash so faint and transient that a delicate dusting of powder had hidden it even from Mrs. Betty's eyes. A few of his most intimate friends had noticed that Parker Steele had the tense, strained look of a man suffering from overwork. That he had given up his nightly cigar and his wine pointed also to the fact that the physician had knowledge of his own needs. To such a man as Steele the zest of life lay in the energetic stir and ostentatious bustle of success. His conceit was in his cleverness, in the smartness of his equipage and reputation, and in the flattering gossip that haunts a healer's name. Parker Steele was essentially a selfish mortal, and selfish men are often the happiest provided they succeed. Yet no man, however selfish, can wholly stifle his own thoughts. That the silence he kept was an immoral silence, no man knew better than did Parker Steele. People would have shrunk from him had they known the truth, as a refined woman shrinks from the offensive carcass of a drunken tramp. His own niceness of taste revolted from the consciousness of chance and undeserved pollution. Ambition was strong in him, however, and the cold tenacity to hold what he had gained. More isolated than Selkirk on his island, he had to bear the bitterness of it alone, knowing that sympathy was locked out by silence. The supreme trying of his powers of hypocrisy came for him in his attitude towards his wife. Parker Steele was in no sense an uxorious fellow, and neither he nor Betty were ever demonstrative towards each other. An occasional half-perfunctory meeting of the lips had satisfied both after the first year of marriage. For this reason Parker Steele's ordeal was less complex and severe than if he had had to repulse an emotional and warm-blooded woman. The first diplomatic development had been insomnia. At least, that was the excuse he made to Betty when he chose to sleep alone in his dressing-room at the back of the house. The faintest sound disturbed him, so he protested, and the rattle of wheels over the cobbles of the square kept him irritably sleepless in the early hours of the morning. To Betty Steele there was no inconsistency in the excuse he gave. She thought him worried and overworked, and there was abundant justification for the latter evil. Winter and early spring are the briskest seasons of a doctor's life. Dr. Steele had had 7 severe cases of pneumonia on his list 1 week. "You are too much in demand, Parker," she had said. "There is always the possibility of a partner to be considered." "Thanks, no. I am not a believer in a cooperative business." "You must take a jaunt somewhere as soon as the work slackens." "All in good time, dear." "Sicily is fashionable." Parker Steele had indulged in optimistic reflections to distract her vigilance. She had sought to prove that he was in stale health by remarking that the wound on his forefinger had not completely healed. He was still wearing the finger-stall that covered the Thornze Origo Mali. "There is absolutely no need for you to fuss about me," he had answered. "I am not made of iron, and the work tells. 3,000 a year is not earned without worry." "As much as that, Parker?" He had touched a susceptible passion in her. "Perhaps more. We shall be able to call our own tune before we are 45. "Heaven defend us, Parker! You hint at terrible things. Respectable obesity and morning prayers." Her husband had laughed, and given her plausible comfort. "You will be more dangerous then than you are now," he had said. In truth, their fortunes were very much in the ascendant, and the social side of professional life had prospered in Mrs. Betty's hands. The brunette was supreme in Roxton, so far as beauty was concerned, supreme also in the yet more magic elements of graceful savoir-faire and tact. She was one of those women who had learned to charm by flattery without seeming to be a sycophant. Moreover, she had tested the wisdom of propitiating her own sex by appearing even more amiable to women than to men. Since the passing of the Murchisons, she had had nothing in the way of rivalry to fear. True, two miserable squatters had put up brass plates in the town, and scrambled for some of the poorer of James Murchison's patients. Mrs. Betty had been able to call upon the wives with patronizing magnanimity. They were both rather dusty, round-backed ladies, with no pretensions to style, either in their own persons or in the persons of their husbands. One of these professional gentlemen, a huge and flat-faced Paddy, resembled a police constable in plain clothes. The other was rather a meek young man in glasses, destitute in any sense of humour, and very useful in the Sunday school. Roxton had weathered Lent and Easter, and Lady Sophia Gillingham, Dame President of the local habitation of the Primrose League, patroness of all Roxton charities, dissenting enterprises excepted, the late lady-in-waiting to the Queen, had called her many dear friends together to discuss the coming Midsummer Bazaar that was held annually for the benefit of the Roxton Cottage Hospital. Roxton, like the majority of small country towns, was a veritable complexity of cliques, and by Roxton should be understood the superior people, who were Unionists in politics, and Church Christians in religion. There were also chapel Christians in Roxton, chiefly of radical persuasion, and therefore hardly decent in the sight of the genteel. People of peculiar views were rare, and not generally encouraged. Some of the orthodox even refused to buy a local tradesman's boots, because that particular tradesman was not a believer in the Trinity. The inference is obvious that the Roxton concerned in Lady Sophia's charitable bazaar was superior and highly cultured Roxton, the Roxton of dinner jackets and distinction, equipages and debrettes. To be a very dear friend of Lady Sophia Gillingham's was to be one of the chosen and elect of God, and Betty Steele had come by that supreme and angelic exaltation. Perhaps Mignon's kitten had purred and gambolled Mrs. Betty into favour. More probably the physician's wife had nothing to learn from any cat. Betty Steele and her husband dined frequently at Roxton Priory. The brunette had even reached the unique felicity of being encouraged in informal and unexpected calls. Lady Sophia possessed a just and proper estimate of her own social position. She was fat, commonplace, and amiable, poorly educated, a woman of few ideas. But she was Lady Sophia Gillingham, and would have expected St. Peter to give her proper precedence over mere commoners in the anteroom of heaven. The third Thursday after Easter, Mrs. Betty Steele drove homeward in a radiant mood, with a spirit of spring stolen from the dull glint of the fat old lady's eyes. There had been an opening committee meeting, and Lady Sophia had expressed it to be her wish that Mrs. Steele should be elected secretary. Moreover, the production of a play had been discussed, a pink muslin drama suited to the susceptibilities of the Anglican public. The part of heroine had been offered, not unanimously, to Mrs. Betty, and with a becoming spirit of diffidence she had accepted the honour, when pressed most graciously by the Lady Sophia's own prosings. Mrs. Betty might have impersonated April as she swept homeward under the high beneficence of St. Antonia's elms. The warmth of worldly well-being plumps out a woman's comeliness. She expands and ripens in the sun of prosperity and praise, in contrast to the thousands of ever-contriving poor, whose sordid faces are but the reflection of sordid facts. Betty Steele's face had an April alluringness that day. Its outlines were soft and beautiful, suggestive of the delicacy of apple bloom seen through morning mist. She was exceeding well content with life, was Mrs. Betty, for her husband was in a position to write generous cheques, and the people of Roxton seemed ready to pay her homage. Parker Steele was reading in the dining-room when this triumphant and happy lady came in like a white flower rising from a sheath of green. It was only when selfishly elated that the wife showed any flow of affection for her husband. For the once she had the air of an enthusiastic girl whom marriage had not robbed of her ideals. "Dear old Parker!" She went towards him with an outstretching of the hands as he dropped the Morning Post and half rose from the lounge-chair. "Had a good time?" "Quite splendid!" She swooped towards him, not noticing the furtive yet watchful expression in her husband's face. "Give me a kiss, old Morning Post." "How is Madame Sophia?" "Most affable." Parker Steel had caught her outstretched hands. It was as though he were afraid of touching his wife's lips. "Making conquests, eh?" "Wa'al, I guess that," and she spoke through her nose. "Dollars?" "Enticing them into the family pocket." Something in her husband's eyes touched Betty Steel beneath her vivacity and easy persiflage. Her husband had risen from his chair, released her hands, and moved away towards the fire. She had a sudden instinct telling her that he was not glad of her return. The wife's airiness was damped instantly. Parker Steel had repelled her with the semi-playful air of a man not wishing to be bothered. She had noticed this suggestion of aloofness much in him of late, and had ascribed it to irritability, the result of overwork. "Anything the matter, dear?" "Matter?" He looked at her frankly, with arched brows and open eyes. "Yes, you seem tired." "There is some excuse for me. This is the first 10 minutes I have had to myself all day. It is an effort to talk when one's tongue has been going for hours." His wife's face appeared a little triste and peevish. She glanced at herself in the mirror over the mantelpiece, and found herself wondering why life seemed composed of actions and reactions. "Have you had tea?" "No, I waited." And he turned and rang the bell with a feeling of relief. It was trying to his watchfulness for Parker Steel to be left alone with his own wife. Even the white cap of the parlour-maid was welcome to him, or the flimsiest barrier that could aid him in his ordeal of silent isolation. The art of hypocrisy grows more complex with each new statement of relationships, and hypocrisy in the home is the regilding of a substance that tarnishes with every day. The wear and tear of life erase the lying surface, and the daily daubing becomes a habit by necessity, even as a single dyeing of the hair pledges the vain mortal to perpetual self-decoration. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. There were many men in Wilton who had looked at their children's graves, little banks of green turf ranged on the hillside where the winds wailed in winter like the mythical spirits of the damned. A gaunt, graceless place, this cemetery, a place where the insignificant dead lived only in the few notches of a mason's chisel upon stone. A high yellow brick wall encompassed its many acres. Immediately within the iron gates stood a tin chapel, a building that might have stood for the Temple of Ugliness, the deity of commercialized towns. On either side of the main walk a row of sickly aspens lifted their slender branches against a hueless sky. To the man and the woman who stood in one corner of this burial-ground, looking down upon a grave that had been but lately banked with turf, there was an infinite and sordid sadness in the scene. 2 graves, not 10 yards away, had been filled in but the day before, and the grass was caked and stained with yellow clay. Near them stood the black wooden shelter used by the officiating priest in dirty weather. A few wreaths, sodden, rain-drenched, the flowers already turning brown, seemed to mock the hands that had placed them there. White headstones everywhere, a few obelisks, a few plain wooden crosses. rank mounds where no name lingered after death. Ever and again the thin clink of the hopeless chapel bell. A grey sky merging into a wet grey landscape. In the valley, Wilton, prostrate under the mist and smoke. James Murchison, standing bareheaded before Gwen's grave, gazed at the wet turf with the eyes of a man who saw more beneath it than mere lifeless clay. There was nothing of rebellion in the pose of the tall figure, rather the slight stoop of one poring over some rare book with the reverence of him who reads to learn. For Catherine there was no consciousness of penance as she stood beside him, silent and distant-eyed. Her hands were clasped together under her cloak. She stood as one waiting, heart heavy, yet ready to awake to the new life that opens even for those who grieve. There were not a few such groups scattered about this upland burial-ground, colourless, subdued figures, seen dimly through the drizzling mist of rain. Quite near to Murchison, a working man was arranging a few flowers in a large white jam-pot. The grave, by the name on the headstone, was the grave of his wife. A few children, who had wandered up to see some funeral, were playing touch wood between the aspens of the main walk. There was an irresponsible callousness in their shrill, slum-hardened voices. To them this place of death was but a field to play in. Murchison had turned from Gwen's grave and was looking at his wife. There seemed some bond more sacred between them now that they had shared both life and death in the body of their child. "You are cold, dear." He touched her cheek with his hand as he turned up the collar of her cloak. Her hair was wet and a-glisten with the rain, her face cold like the face of one fresh from the breath of an autumn sea. "Only my skin. The wind is keen, though. It is time we turned back home." "Yes." "Good-bye, my child." He spoke the words in a whisper as they moved away from the corner. Before them, seen dimly through a haze of rain, lay the colliery town, a vague splash of darkness in the valley. Here and there a tall chimney stood trailing smoke, or the faint glow of a fire gave a thin opalescence to the shell of mist. Sounds, faint and far, yet full in the significance of labour, drifted up the bleak slopes of the hillside, like the sounds from ships sailing a foggy sea. The rattle of a train, the shriek of a steam-whistle, the slow strokes of some great clock striking the hour. James Murchison's eyes were fixed upon this town beside the pit-mouths, this pool of poverty and toil, where the eddies of effort never ceased upon the surface. It was strange to him, this colliery town, and yet familiar. Always would his manhood yearn towards it because of the dear dead, even though its memories were hateful to him, full of the bitterness of ignominy and pain. Gwen's death had come to Murchison as a sudden silence, a strange void in the hurrying entities of life. It was as though the passing of this child had changed the phenomena of existence for him, and given a new rhythm to the pulse of time. He had become aware of a new setting to life, even as a man who has walked the same road day by day discovers on some winter dawn a fresh and unearthly beauty in the scene. He felt an unsolved newness in his being, a solemnity such as those who have looked upon the dead must feel. And no strong nature can pass through such a phase without creating inward energy and power. Sorrow, like winter, may be but a season of repose, troubled and drear perhaps, but moving towards the miracle of spring. Wilton Cemetery, with its zinc-roofed chapel, its yellow walls and iron gates, lay behind them, while the dim horizon ran in a grey blur along the hills. Husband and wife walked for a time in silence, for each had a burden of deep thought to bear. It was the man who spoke first, quietly and with restraint, and yet with something of the fierce spirit of an outcast Cain visible upon his face. "I have been thinking of what I said to you last night." She was looking at him with a brave clearness of the eyes. I suppose sensible people would call such a venture mad." "We are often strongest, dear, when we are most mad." He swung on beside her, his eyes at gaze. "The madness of a forlorn hope. No, it is not that. I have not any of the impudence of the adventurer. It is something more solemn, more grim, more for a final end." "Beloved, I understand." "Are you not afraid for me?" "No, no." She put her hand under his arm. "God give us both courage, dear," she said. They had reached the outskirts of Wilton, and the ugliness of the place was less visible in these outworks of the town. The streets had something of the quaintness of antiquity about them, for this was a part of the real Wilton, an old English townlet that had been gripped and strangled by the decapod of the pits. "About your mother's money, Kate." The rumble of a passing van compelled silence for a moment. "You must retain the whole control." "I?" "Yes." He heard a woman's unwillingness in her voice. "It is my wish, dear. I shall need a certain sum to start with, but my life insurance can be made a security for that." "James!" Her face reproached him. "Are we so little married that what is mine is not yours also?" "It is because you are my wife, Kate, that I consider these things. Your mother was wise, though her instructions do not flatter me. Legally, I cannot touch a single penny." She looked troubled and a little impatient. "I shall hate the money if—no, I don't mean that. But, dear," and she drew very close to him in the twilight of the streets, "it will make no difference. You will not feel—" "Feel, Kate?" "That it is mine and not yours. You know, dear, what I mean. I don't want to think that you will feel as though you had to ask." They looked, man and wife, into each other's eyes. "I shall ask, Kate, because—" "Because?" "You are what you are. It will not hurt me to remember that the stuff is yours." Now, quite an hour ago a battered and moth-eaten cab had deposited a stout lady on the doorstep of Clovelly. The stout lady had a round white face that beamed sympathetically from under the arch of a rather grotesque bonnet. A girl, hired for the month, and dressed in a makeshift black frock, had opened the door 3 inches to Miss Carmagee. There had been a confidential discussion between these two, the girl letting the gap between the door and door-post increase before the lady in the grotesque bonnet. The doctor and the missus were out, and Master Jack having tea at a friend's house in the next street. So much Miss Carmagee had learned before she had been admitted to the little front room. It was quite dusk when Catherine and her husband turned in at the garden gate. The blinds were down, the gas lit. Murchison opened the front door with his key, remembering, as he ever remembered, the golden head that would shine no more for him in that diminutive, dreary house. He was hanging his coat on a peg in the passage when he heard a sharp cry from Catherine, who had entered the front room. There was the rustling of skirts, the sound of an inarticulate greeting between 2 eager friends. No one could have doubted Miss Carmagee's solid identity. She was resting her hands on Catherine's shoulders. They had kissed each other like mother and child. "Why, when did you come? We had no letter. James! James!" Murchison found them holding hands. There were tears in Miss Carmagee's mild blue eyes. Warned of her coming, he might have shirked the meeting with the pride of a man too sensitive towards the past. But Miss Carmagee in the flesh, motherly and very gentle, with Catherine's kisses warm upon her face, stood for nothing that was critical or chilling to the heart. He met her with open hands. "You have taken us by surprise." Miss Phyllis's eyes were on the sad, memory-shadowed face. "I had to come," and her voice failed her a little. "I shan't worry you. We are old friends." She put up her benign and ugly face as though the privilege of a mother belonged to her by nature. I have felt it all so much." A flash of infinite yearning leaped up and passed in the man's eyes. "You must be tired," he said, clinging to commonplaces. "Have they sent your luggage up?" Miss Carmagee sank into a chair. "I left it at the hotel. I am not going to be a worry." "Worry?" "Of course not, child." "Oh, but we must have you here. James?" "My dear," and the substantial nature of the old lady's person seemed to become evident, "I insist on sleeping there to-night. Now, humour me, or I shall feel myself a nuisance." Miss Carmagee's solidity of will made her contention impregnable. Moreover, the common-sense view she took of the matter boasted a large element of discretion. People who live in a small house on £160 a year cannot be expected to be prepared for social emergencies. Even a philosopher is limited by the contents of his larder, and Miss Carmagee was one of those excellent women whose philosophy takes note of the trivial things of life: pots, pans, and linen, the cold end of mutton, the rice pudding to supply 3. It is truly regrettable that a man's Promethean spirit should be bound down by such contemptible trifles. Yet a tactful refusal to share a suet pudding may be worth more than the wittiest epigram ever made. Miss Carmagee and Catherine spent an hour alone together that evening, for Murchison had patients waiting for him at Dr. Tugler's surgery in Wilton High Street. Master Jack had returned from his tea-party to be hugged, presented with a box of soldiers, a clasp-knife, and a prayer-book, and then hurried off to bed. The soldiers and the knife shared the sheets with him. The prayer-book, amiable aunts forgive, was left derelict under an arm-chair. But the great event that night for these two women, such contrasts and yet so alike in the deeper things of the soul, came with that communing together before the fire, the lights turned low, the room in shadow. It was some while before Miss Carmagee approached the purpose that had brought her across England with bag and baggage. She was a woman of tact, and it is not easy to be a partisan at times without wounding those whom we wish to help. The elder woman had hardly broached the subject before Catherine, sitting on a cushion beside Miss Carmagee's chair, turned from the firelight with an eager lifting of the head. "Why, it was only yesterday that James spoke to me of such a plan." "To return to us?" "Yes, and win back what he lost." Miss Carmagee saw her way more clearly. "You know, child, you have many friends." "I?" "Yes, and your husband also. Porteus and I discussed the matter. You must not think us busybodies, dear." A kiss was the surest answer. "I was afraid when James first spoke of it." "Afraid?" "Yes," and she coloured. "It was cowardly of me, but I remembered how we left the place. It will be an ordeal. We shall have to walk through fire together. But still—" "Well, child," and Miss Carmagee let her have her say. "Still, there is a greatness in the plan that takes my heart. We women love our husbands to be brave. I know what it will mean to James. He says that many people will think him mad." Miss Carmagee sat stroking one of Catherine's hands. "It is the right kind of madness," she said softly. "To rise above public opinion? Yes, when we are in the right." They sat for a while in silence, looking into the fire, Catherine's head against Miss Carmagee's shoulder. Above, in the nursery, Jack Murchison was trying his new knife on the rail of a bedroom chair. He had crept out of bed, rummaged up some matches, and lit the gas. The boy had no eyes for the empty cot in the far corner of the room. He had not yet grasped what the loss of a life in the home meant. "I want you to promise me something, dear." Miss Carmagee's hand touched the mother's hair. "Yes?" "I want you to tell me frankly about the money." Catherine looked up into the benign white face. "You mean—" "I mean, dear, that there is a lot of dusting and polishing to be done before the lawyers allow people to step into their own shoes. I have a pair that I could lend you for a year or so." Catherine smiled at the simile, despite the occasion. Miss Carmagee's shoes were as large and generous as her heart. "It is too good of you. They tell me I have inherited property that will bring in an income of 700 to 800 a year. I don't think—" "Well?" "That we could let you be so generous." Miss Carmagee leaned forward in her chair. "Generous? It is not generous, dear. A mere matter of convenience." "You call it merely convenience?" "No, child, I ought to call it a blessing to me, a true blessing. Don't you understand that it would make me very happy?" "Yes, I understand." "That's right." "How good and kind you are." "Nonsense, dear, nonsense." Chapter 29. Chapter 30 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. Mr. Gehogan, a gentleman from Ireland, who had attempted to possess himself of the scatterings of James Murchison's practice, had discovered no proper spirit of appreciation in Roxton, and as though to register his displeasure, had departed abruptly, so abruptly that he had left behind him many unpaid bills. The house in Lombard Street had held him and his progeny for some seasons, and the family had left its mark upon the place in more instances than one. Miss Carmagee and her brother, who went over the house for some unexplained reason, concluded that clean paint and paper, and many scrubbings with soap and water, were needed for the effacement of an atmosphere of mediæval sanctity. The charwoman averred, an excellent authority, that the late tenant had kept pigs in a shed at the end of the garden, and had salted and stored the bacon in the bath. The house itself had been left littered with all sorts of rubbish. Dr. Gehogan's youngsters had turned the back garden into a species of pleasance by the sea. There was a big puddle in the middle of the lawn, and oyster shells, broken bricks, and jam jars had accumulated to an extraordinary extent. About the end of April, such people of observation as passed down Lombard Street discovered that the great red brick house was preparing for new tenants. Mr. Clayton, the decorator, had hung his professional board from the central first-floor window. Sashes were being repainted white, the front door an aesthetic green. Paper-hangers were at work in the chief rooms, and whitewash brushes splashed and flapped in the kitchen quarters. Questioned by interested fellow tradesmen as to the name and nature of the incoming tenant, Mr. Clayton blinked and confessed his ignorance. He was working under Mr. Porteus Carmagee's orders. Mr. Clayton had never even heard that the house had changed hands, and that the lawyer had bought it from the late owner, but whether it was let, Mr. Clayton could not tell. Even Mr. Beasley, the local house-agent, was no wiser in the matter. Speculation remained possible, while the more pushing of the local tradesmen were ready at any moment to tout for the newcomer's esteemed patronage. One afternoon early in May, a large furniture van, manoeuvring to and fro in Lombard Street, and absorbing the whole road, compelled a stylish carriage and pair to come to a sharp halt. The carriage was Dr. Parker Steele's, and it contained his wife, a complacent study in pink, with the pert little white hat perched on a most elaborate yet seemingly simple coiffure. The footway opposite the Murchisons' old house was littered with straw and stray odds and ends of furniture, while two men in green baize aprons were struggling up the steps with a Chesterfield sofa. Through one of the open windows of the dining-room, Betty Steele's sharp eyes caught sight of Miss Carmagee, rigged up in a white apron and unpacking china with the help of one of her maids. The furniture van had made port, and Parker Steele's carriage rolled on into St. Antonia's Square. Mrs. Betty's eyes had clouded a little under her Paris hat, for unpleasant thoughts are invariably suggested by the faces of people who do not love us. The ego in self-conscious mortals is sensitive as a piece of smoked glass. The passing of the faintest shadow is registered upon its surface, and its lustre may be dimmed by a chance breath. This house in Lombard Street had never lost for Betty its suggestion of passive hostility. Its associations always stirred the energies of an unforgotten hate, and though triumphant, she often found herself frowning when she passed the place. Moreover, Miss Carmagee had been the other woman's friend, and in life there can be no neutrality when rivals fight for survival in the business of success. Betty Steele had come from the orchards that were white about Roxton Priory, yet the glimpse of the stir and movement in that red brick house had blown the May bloom from her thoughts. Did Kate Murchison ever wish herself back in Lombard Street? What had become of her and her children? Betty Steele woke from a moment's reverie as the carriage drew up before her own home. The elderly parlour-maid, 5 feet of starch, to say nothing of the cap, opened the front door to Mrs. Betty. There was an inquisitive lift about the woman's eyelids, and Betty Steele, an expert in the deciphering of faces, expected news of some sort or another. "Anyone in the drawing-room, Simons?" "No, ma'am." "Well?" "Dr. Steele is in the study. He wished me to say that he would see you the moment you came home." Nearly 24 hours had passed since Betty Steele had seen her husband. The physician had been called up in the night, and had breakfasted away. She herself had lunched with Lady Gillingham, so that their paths had run uncrossed since yesterday. "Has anyone called?" "No, ma'am." "You may bring up tea." The Venetian blinds were down in the consulting-room, an initial coincidence, for Parker Steele was a believer in light. He was sitting at the bureau by the window, but glanced over his shoulder as his wife entered. "Is that you, dear?" "Yes, what is it?" She was playing with her silk scarf, and looking with rather a puzzled air at her husband. "I've just sent off a wire to town." "A wire?" "Yes, to Turner, for a first-class locum. The man will be here early to-morrow. Shut the door, dear, shut the door." There was an irritable harshness of voice and a jerkiness of manner that betrayed unusual lack of self-control. Her husband's back was half turned to her, and he was scribbling on a sheet of paper that he had before him, but she could see the frown upon his forehead and the nervous working of his lips. "What is the matter, Parker?" "Oh, nothing serious. Only one of your prophecies come home to roost." "My prophecies?" "Yes, about overwork. I was a fool not to knock off earlier. Some inflammatory trouble in my eyes." "Eyes?" She echoed the word, showing for the first time some stirrings of alarm. "What is it?" "Strain, nothing more. It came on quite suddenly. I shall have to have a month's absolute rest." He leaned back and put a hand up to his forehead. "Let me look." Betty went to him and leaned her hands upon the side rail of his chair. "You won't make much of them. See, I'm just writing out a few hints and directions." "They look inflamed, Parker." He shrugged impatiently. "Don't bother about the eyes. See, I want you to give these notes to Turner's locum when he comes. The list is complete, with a cross against the more important people. The work's lighter again. He can manage it alone." "Yes," but she still looked troubled. "I shall get away by the 10:15 tomorrow morning." "Where are you going?" "Oh, to Torquay. I've wired to a hotel. Ramsden is doing eye work down there, you know. He will soon put me right." Betty stood with her hands resting on the back of his chair. His assurances had not wholly satisfied her. She had a vague feeling that he was keeping something back. "Parker?" "Yes, dear." He appeared busy, dashing down professional hieroglyphics on the paper before him. "You are not keeping anything from me?" "Anything from you?" "Yes. It is nothing dangerous." "My dear girl, I ought to know." She sighed, looked at the darkened window, and then, stooping suddenly, kissed him softly on the cheek. "Parker." He had reddened and drawn aside, with an irritable knitting of the brows. "Leave me alone, dear, for a while. I want to put the practice in order." Repulsed, she removed her hands from the chair. I was only anxious." "Don't worry, there's no cause. You will stay here and look after things for me?" "Yes, I can have Madge to stay." "And Betty?" "Yes." "Don't say much about the eyes. It doesn't do for a professional man to get a reputation for feebleness in his physical equipment." "I shall not say anything." "Thanks. You see, I'm rather busy." She turned, looked round the room vaguely, her face cold and empty of any marked expression. Then she went slowly to the door, opened it, and passed out into the hall. The house seemed peculiarly dim and lonely as she climbed the stairs to her own room. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of A Woman Swore by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31. "Good-bye, Mrs. Murchison. Good-bye, old man. Wish you could have stayed with us. Shake hands, sonny, now you're off." A barrow-load of belated luggage went clattering by as the shrill pipe of the guard's whistle sounded the departure. On the opposite platform a couple of porters were banging empty milk cans onto a truck. Yet from the noise and turmoil of it all, John Tugler's red face shone out with a redeeming exuberance of goodwill. Good-bye. Murchison was leaning from the window, and the two men shook hands. "Good luck to you." "Thanks. You have been very good to us. We shall not forget it." "Bosh, man, bosh!" And John Tugler gave Catherine a final flourish of his hat. The train was on the move, but Murchison still leaned from the window, to the exclusion of his excited and irrepressible son. We grow fond of people who have stood by us in trouble, and John Tugler, bumptious and money-making mortal that he was, carried many generous impulses under his gorgeous waistcoat. The gift of sympathy covers a multitude of imperfections, for the heart craves bread and wine from others, and not the philosopher's stone. Interminable barriers of brick, backyards, sour, rubbish-ridden gardens were gliding by. Factories with their tall chimneys, the minarets of labour, stood out above the crowded greyness of the monotonous streets. Hardly a tree, and not an acre of green grass in Wilton. It was as though nature had cursed the place, and left it no symbol of the season, no passing pageantry of summer, autumn, or of spring. Catherine had kept Jack by her side, and the boy was kneeling on the seat and looking out of the window. She felt that her husband was in no mood for the child's chattering. In leaving Wilton, he was leaving a poignant part of reality behind, to enter upon a life that should try the strength of his manhood as a bowman tries a bow. An old lady and a consumptive clerk were their only fellow-travellers. Murchison had chosen a corner whose window looked towards the west, and an intense and determined face it was that stared out over the ugliness of Wilton town. Houses had given place to market gardens, acres of cabbages, flat, dismal, and dotted with zinc-roofed sheds. Beyond came the slow, sad heave of the Wilton hills, and seen dimly, white specks upon the hillside, the crowded headstones where the dead slept. The eyes of husband and wife met for a moment. They smiled at each other with the wistful cheerfulness of two people who have determined to be brave, a pathetic pretence hardly created to deceive. Moroseness need not testify deep feeling. The gleam from between the clouds turns even the wet clouds to gold. Jack Murchison was watching a couple of colts cantering across the field beside the line. "Mother, look at the old horses." "Yes, dear. Silly old things. They're making that old cow run. The brown one's like Wellington, the horse we had before Dad bought the car." "So it is, dear." "Perhaps it is Wellington." "No, dear, Wellington must be dead by now." The old lady in the opposing corner was looking at Jack over her spectacles, and the boy took to returning this stare with the inimitable composure of youth. Catherine had turned again towards the other window, but the white headstones no longer checkered the hillside. Instead, she saw her husband's profile, stern and determined, yet infinitely sad. Life has been described as a series of sensations, and though some days are dull and passionless, others vibrate with 1,000 waves of feeling. To Murchison the day had been crowded with sensation since the break of dawn. It was a day of disruption, a plucking up of routine from the soil, a change of attitude that concerned the soul even more than the body. He yearned towards Wilton, and yet fled from it with gratitude. His old home called to him, and yet he dreaded it, as a disgraced man might fear the shocked faces of familiar friends. It was a day of unrest, self-judgment, and great forethought for him. The physical atoms seemed to tremble and vibrate, till the manhood in him might have been likened to a tremulous vapour. He could eat nothing, fix his mind on nothing. Even the sagging wires, coming and going as the train swept from pole to pole, were not unsymbolic of his thoughts. 200 miles, with an hour's wait in London, and the monotonous Midlands, gave place to the more mysterious and dreamy south. Pine-crowned hills, great oaks, and beeches purpling the villages, the blue distance of a more magical horizon. In orchards and meadows the infinite glamour of a golden spring. Quiet rivers curling through the mists of green. In many a park the stately spruce built sombre, windless thickets. Larches glimmered with Scotch firs red-throated towards the west. Trees in whispering and triumphant multitudes, quiet, dreamy meadows where the willows waved, mysterious isles of Avalon imaginable towards the setting sun. Murchison, leaning back in his corner, watched for the pine woods about Roxton town with a deep commingling of yearning and of dread. It was to be a home-coming, and yet what a home-coming! The return of a prodigal, but no cringing prodigal. The return of a man, stiff-necked and square-jawed, ready to fight, but not to conciliate. There was something of the tense expectancy of the hour before the bugles blow the assault. Every nerve in Murchison's body tingled. The boy Jack was jumping from foot to foot at the other window. "Look, mother, look! There's old Mr. Tomkins's farm, and there's the river. Look, and the kingcups are out. Gwen used to call 'em—" He stopped suddenly, for his mother had drawn him to her and smothered the words with her mouth. "You take care of the rugs and umbrellas, dear." "Yes, shall I get 'em down?" "In a minute. Sit still, dear, and don't worry." She looked across quickly at her husband. Their eyes met. He was pale, but he smiled at her. "Here we are at last." At last. Both felt that the ordeal had begun. They let the boy lean out of the open window as the train ran in, and slowed up beside the platform. Porteus Carmagee and his sister were waiting by the door of the booking-office. Jack sighted them and waved a salute, their coach running far beyond the office, for they were in the forepart of the train. Murchison was the first out of the carriage. He lifted the boy down, and stood waiting to help his wife with some of her parcels. "Luggage, sir?" Murchison turned, and stared straight into the face of one of his old patients. The man looked at him blankly for a moment before recognition dawned upon his face. "Good day, doctor. Didn't know you, sir, at first," and he touched his cap. Murchison's upper lip was stiff. He looked like one who had come to judge rather than to be judged. "Get my luggage out, Johnson. 3 trunks, a Gladstone hat-box, and 2 wooden cases." "Yes, sir." The man was polite, though ready to be inquisitive. "Glad to see you again in Roxton, sir." "Thanks." "Cab, sir? There's Timmins's fly." "Yes, that will do." Murchison turned abruptly from the porter to find Miss Carmagee and Catherine kissing, and Jack tugging at his godfather's hands. It was Porteus in a new Panama hat, whose whiteness made his face look brown as an Asiatic's. "Ah, my dear Murchison, 10 minutes late. Beast of a line, this." "It was good of you to come." "Eh, what? Not a bit of it. Where's your luggage? I abhor stations. Can't talk in comfort. This imp of darkness can come along with us." An unprejudiced observer would have imagined the little man in the most peppery of tempers. He tweaked Jack by the ear, frowned hard at Catherine, and bit his moustache as though possessed by some uncontrollable spirit of impatience. His sister was straightening her bonnet strings. "You can drive straight home, dear. Everything is ready." "You don't know how much I feel all this." "There, you must be tired. We are going to take the boy to-night." Miss Carmagee's stout figure seemed to stand like a breakwater between Catherine and the world, and there was an all-sufficing courage on her face. People were staring. Murchison became aware of it as they moved towards the booking-office. Several familiar faces seemed to start up vividly out of the past. He noticed two porters grinning and talking together beside a pile of luggage near the bridge, and his sensitive pride concluded that they were making him their mark. The ticket collector was a thin, grey-headed man whom Murchison had known for years. He found himself conjecturing, as one conjectures over trifles at such a pass, whether the man would remember him or not. The official received the tickets without vouchsafing a glimmer of recognition, but he stared after Murchison when he had passed, with that curious, peering insolence typical of the breed. Outside the station, a very throaty individual in a very big cap, Harris tweed suit, white stock, and mulberry-red waistcoat, was giving instructions to a porter with regard to a barrow-load of luggage. A trim dog-cart stood by the curb, with a sleek little woman in a tailor-made costume perched on the seat, and looking down on everybody with something of the keenness of a hawk. It so happened that this exquisite piece of breeding, this Colonel Larter of country fame, stepped back against Murchison in turning towards his dog-cart. "Beg pardon." The words were reinforced by a surprised and rather impertinent stare. "What?" "Don't trouble to mention it, sir." "How do you do? Had heard you were knocking about down our way. Wife well?" Colonel Larter's glance had passed the figure in black, and had fixed itself on the Carmagees and Catherine. There is always some charm about a handsome woman that can command courtesy, and Colonel Larter walked round Murchison with the sang-froid of a superior person, and ignored the husband in appearing impressive to the wife. "How d'ye do, Mrs. Murchison? Back in Roxton? Miss Carmagee has been keeping secrets from us. Quite a crime, I'm sure." Catherine had seen the slighting of her husband. "We are back again, Colonel Larter." "That's good. To stay?" And he nodded affably to the lawyer. "Yes, to stay." "And the piccaninnies? Hullo, here's one of them. And where's my little flirt? What, left her behind?" Colonel Larter had one of those high-pitched, patronizing voices that carry a goodly distance and allow casual listeners to benefit by their remarks. Yet even his obtuse conceit was struck by Catherine Murchison's manner. A sudden sense of distance and discomfort obtruded itself upon the gentleman's consciousness. He caught Porteus Carmagee's brown, bird-like eye, and the glint thereof was curiously disconcerting. "Expect you're busy. My wife's waiting for me. Mustn't delay." And he withdrew with a jerk of his peaked cap, repassing Murchison with an oblivious serenity, and rejoining his wife, who had acknowledged the presence of acquaintances by a single inclination of the head. "Insufferable ass! Where's that luggage? Ah, here we are." And Porteus opened the cab door with emphasis. "Get in, Kate. You'll find everything ship-shape at home." "You will come across later?" "If I'm wanted." "Then we shall expect you both. We have not thanked you yet." "Oh, if I'm to be thanked, I shan't come." "Don't say that," and Murchison's hand rested for a moment on Porteus Carmagee's shoulder. Lombard Street again, broad, tranquil Lombard Street, warm with its red-walled houses, shaded by its cypresses, its budding elms and limes, St. Antonia's steeple clear against the blue, the old house itself white-sashed and sun-steeped, curtains at the windows, the steps white and fresh as snow. A head disappeared from the hall window as the cab drove up. The front door opened. They were welcomed by a homely and familiar face. "Mary!" "Yes, ma'am." "This is like home." "I'm glad, ma'am, I'm glad." Catherine kissed her. They were both good women, and heart met heart in that home-coming, so full of memories of mingled joy and pain. "It is good to see you here, Mary," and Murchison held out his hand. "Oh, sir, it was good to come." "You will only have one to worry you now." "It wasn't a worry, sir." And she retreated, because her weakness was a woman's weakness and showed itself in tears. A man was helping the cabman with the luggage. He came in carrying one end of a heavy trunk, cap in hand, gaiters on legs, a smart figure that seemed a little faded and out of fortune, to judge by the threadbare cleanliness of his clothes. "What, you here, Gage?" The man coloured up like a boy. "Glad to see you, sir, and you, ma'am. The old house begins to look itself again." "You are right, Gage. Old faces make a welcome surer. We shall want you if you are free." "Only too happy, sir. Family man now, sir." "What, married?" "A year last Easter, sir." And he disappeared up the stairs, carrying the lower end of the trunk. An hour had passed. Husband and wife had wandered over the whole house together, and found many an old familiar friend that had been saved from the wreck of that disastrous year. The sympathetic touch showed everywhere. A reverent and sensitive spirit had schemed and plotted to retain the past. The colouring of each room was the same as of old. Much of the furniture had been rebought. The very pictures were as so many memories. It was home, and yet not the home they had known of yore. Does it feel strange to you? Strange? Yes, it is all so real, and yet there is something we shall always miss. They were standing together at the study window, looking out into the garden that was lit with flowers. Polyanthuses were as so many gems scattered on the brown earth of the beds. An almond tree was still in bloom, a blush of pink against the sky. Tulips, red, white, and yellow, lifted their cups to the falling dew. "It can never be the same, dear." "No." "Gwen?" "Yes, our little one. And yet, in death—" "In death?" "My child has given me victory over myself. As I trust God, dear, I believe that curse is dead." "Yes, it is dead. The house is cleansed. We have come home together. I am ready now to face my fellow men." End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32. It is said that a pretty woman is never out of patience when she has a glass to gaze at, and Betty Steele, casting critical yet complacent glasses into the depths of a Venetian mirror, awaited the descent of her very particular friend, Madge Ellison, with the sweet content of a lily waiting for the moon. Mrs. Betty's face was a Diana's face, but her body was of the colour of a blush rose in her summer rose dress. The figure had charm enough as it idled to and fro in the spacious, mellow-tinted room. Mirror and window showed her patronage. The one symbolical of self alone, the other of that same self's outlook upon life at large. Betty was in one of her most radiant moods. A letter had come for her from her husband by the morning post. His eyes were much better, and there was no cloud upon the horizon. Parker Steele's wife heard the frou-frou of a silk petticoat sweeping down the stairs, the sudden opening of the study door, a man's footstep crossing the hall. What, out to tea again in your best frock?" The rustling of silk ceased for a moment at the foot of the stairs. Betty Steele smiled like a wise and intelligent elder sister. Madge Ellison and their most stylish locum tenens, Dr. Little, had reached that degree of familiarity that permits two people to spar amiably with each other. "A grievance, as usual. I suppose you grudge us the carriage." "Nothing half so selfish, I assure you." "Why not come and pay calls with us?" "The old proverb, Miss Ellison. A little goes a long way, is that it?" "Am I so little?" "What's in a name?" And she passed on with a significant side glance and an arch lifting of the chin. Dr. Little, a black-chinned, tailor-waisted, superfine person, with a distinct air, proceeded on a hypothetical expedition up the stairs. He had remembered leaving his latchkey in his bedroom, a useful excuse for meeting a pretty woman on the way, as though the coincidence were supremely natural. Au revoir. Miss Ellison favoured him with an undeniable wink as she picked up a pink parasol from the hall table. She was one of those women who remind one forcibly of the stage beauty as seen on very young men's mantelpieces. Madge Ellison would show as much of an open-work stocking as was compatible with social refinement. A retroussé nose and a round and rather cheeky chin associated themselves naturally with her methods of fascination. "Madge!" "Yes, dear." "Here, quick, I want you." "Bless my soul, why this tragic note?" "Look, the window. Do you recognize any one by the church railings?" There was a hard abruptness in Betty Steele's voice. She was leaning forward with her hand on the window-sill, her face curiously changed in its expression from the purring contentment of 2 minutes ago. "I see a solitary female, dear." "Don't you recognize her?" Miss Ellison gave a quaint and expressive little whistle. "No, surely it can't be." "Kate Murchison." "By George, dear, it is!" The two friends watched the figure in black disappear under the old gatehouse that stood at the northwest corner of the square. For Madge Ellison there was nothing more inspiriting than curiosity in the event. To Betty Steele that passing glimpse had opened up all the hatred of the past. "What's in your mind, Madge?" Miss Ellison was buttoning her gloves. "I'll bet a tea-cake to a penny, bun, dear, that it is the Murchisons who have taken their house in Lombard Street again." "Nonsense!" Betty Steele's eyes grew hard and dangerous at the suggestion. "Why nonsense? The Murchisons would hardly have the impudence to sneak back to Roxton. People don't care to be bungled into the next world by a drunkard." "My word, Betty, draw it mild. I never heard that the man drank." "You were in Italy then, I believe." "Nasty, nasty. You are peevish over the poor people's failings." "I hate that woman, Madge." Miss Ellison laughed at the sincerity of her friend's spite. "Why, what earthly harm can that woman do you by choosing to live in Roxton?" "I tell you, Madge, there are some people in this world who set one's teeth on edge. After all, what need for all this waste of antipathy? Kate Murchison must be staying with the Carmagees. I'll risk that as my explanation." Spirited away on a round of social duties, Betty Steele and her friend paid their third call that afternoon at the Canonry in Canon's Court, off Cloister Street. A row of carriages under the avenue of limes, and a liveried servant standing on duty under the Georgian portico, reminded Betty Steele that the third Friday in the month was the date printed on Mrs. Stensley's cards. Betty and her gossip were announced in the crowded drawing-room, where a number of bored figures were balancing teacups and talking with forced animation. A few men, severely saddened by their responsibilities, were treading on each other's heels, and looking anxiously for ladies who would take pity on sandwiches or cake. The French windows of the room were open to the May sunshine of the garden, and the fringes of a cedar could be seen sweeping the sleek grass. Individual faces disassociate themselves slowly from such an assemblage, and Betty Steele, blockaded under the lee of a grand piano, had but half the room under the ken of her keen eyes. Madge Ellison had been left to chat with Mr. Keighley, a very popular and enthusiastic curate, who had rendered his character doubly fascinating by professing to hold prejudices in favour of celibacy. Betty had a brewer's wife at her elbow. They had exchanged ecstatic confidences on the exquisite shape and colour of Mrs. Stensley's tea-service, and were both groping for some further topic to keep the conversation moving. "And how is the play going, Mrs. Steele?" "The play?" Mrs. Betty seemed unusually pensive and distraught. "Lady Sophia's play?" "As well as a piece can go, with amateurs. We all find fault with our neighbours." "I hear it is a splendid little play." "Not at all bad." "I must say I like the pathetic style of play." "Oh, yes, quite charming." "I saw Julia Neilson play in that part. Oh, what was the play called?" "A woman of no ideal, most likely," thought Mrs. Betty. "I wonder how many more times she is going to read on that one unfortunate word." She waited demurely for the title to recur, but it appeared lost in the limbo of the fat lady's mind. The brewer's wife continued to grope for it like a conscientious housewife who has lost the Sabbath threepenny bit in her glove-box while dressing for church. Betty Steele, however, had become utterly oblivious to her presence for the moment. She was gazing towards one of the open windows, where a woman's figure, tall and comely in simple black, showed against the rich green of the grass. The woman's back was turned towards the room, but Betty knew her by her figure and the lustre of her hair. "Very odd, Mrs. Steele. I can't remember the name of that play." "Really, I beg your pardon. I was thinking of other things." A slight rearranging of this aggregate of Roxton culture released Betty Steele from this amiable mass of irresponsible bathos. She contrived to wedge herself beside Madge Ellison, whose retroussé nose had failed to tempt the celibate to expand. "You see?" A smart hat was tilted significantly towards the window. "I do." "Any news?" "You have lost, dear. The tea-cake is on top." "The sensation of Roxton. They are here to stay." Mrs. Betty's face expressed infinite pity. "How eccentric!" "Kate Murchison has had money left her." "And the husband?" "I hear his plate is up in Lombard Street." Whether it was a mere matter of coincidence or the working of a definite purpose, the fact was curiously self-evident to Betty Steele that the drawing-room of the canonry had divided itself into two camps. Windowward sat Miss Carmagee, dressed in black, her large face shining like a buckler against the embattled foe. Porteus, the irascible Porteus, who blasphemed all tea-parties, was chattering like a little brown baboon. Several of Kate Murchison's old friends appeared to have congregated together on the opposition benches. Mrs. Betty remarked all this, and her mouth grew a mere line in her pale and alert face. The breweress had risen to depart. A number of nervous people who had been waiting for some bold spirit to initiate the movement followed the fat lady's inspiriting example. Mrs. Stensley was in the garden. The breweress and her flock of sheep filed through the open window to shake hands and go. "Madge, hello, dear, am I sitting on you? Whither away?" "To pay my most dutiful respects." Catherine Murchison and the canon had left the window and were pacing the grass under the benisons of the great cedar. By the expression on their faces and the serious yet sympathetic inflection of their voices, they had broken the mere social surface and were speaking of deeper things. It is the fashion to abuse the priesthood in the abstract, yet any critic who took the clean-girt manliness of Canon Stensley's character might find his rhetoric chilled in its free flow. "You have done the right thing, and your true friends will be glad of it." "It was my husband's wish." "The wish of a brave man." "What a wonderful thing is sympathy! You have helped me so much this afternoon. It was an ordeal. You know, we dread the unknown, uncertainty." The big, grey-headed man looked down at her with much of the affection of a father. His hands had given her confirmation and joined her in marriage. "Doubt is a great distorting glass," he said simply. "The difficulties of life decrease the moment they are faced." "I am glad you are on our side." "I should be a poor Christian if I were not." A figure in a pink dress, sumptuous and perfect as to the milliner's craft, glided across the grass and cast a shadow at Catherine's feet. "How do you do, Kate? You have surprised us all, assuredly." The two women touched hands. Betty Steele's drawl ascended towards patronage. She assumed the air of a mistress of a salon whose salutation decided destinies and dispensed fame. "How is Dr. Murchison? This long rest must have done him good." "Thanks, my husband is very well." "I am afraid we all misunderstood your plans. We thought you had left Roxton for good. I suppose Dr. Murchison will not expose himself again to the strain of general practice. Surgical cases are such a responsibility." It is the ability of women to be politely insolent, and to cover a taunt with ironical courtesy. There were at least a dozen people within range of Mrs. Betty's aggressive drawl, and Betty Steele had no intention of letting Roxton forget James Murchison's past. "And how are the children?" Her eyes were studying the details of Catherine's dress with the critical acuteness so trying to a woman. "The boy is very well, thanks." "And the other, a girl, was it not?" "You need not trouble to remember her." "That sounds as though you were disappointed. I remember how you used to read me texts on the divinity of motherhood." "The child is dead, Betty, that is all." "I am sorry to hear that. I always thought the girl was delicate." Canon Stensly's massive shadow interposed itself between the slighter silhouettes upon the grass. "Your husband has kept his promise, Mrs. Murchison." "Is he here?" "Yes, yonder, with my wife." Betty Steele's face was tinged with malignity that leaked from her eyes and from the sneering angles of her mouth. She felt glad that Catherine's favourite child was dead. The incomprehensible malice in the thought justified itself in the reflection that Catherine had lost something that she, Betty, had always lacked. She passed James Murchison as she returned towards the house, a man with a certain dignity of past suffering writ heavily upon his face. He was talking to two old friends. Betty swept by him without troubling to notice whether he bowed to her or not. The man was a mere pawn in the game, so far as she was concerned. Any humiliation that he might suffer was only valuable so far as it humiliated his wife. The carriage was waiting for them under the limes of Canon's Court. Madge Ellison flounced down in her corner with a relieved sigh. "What a function! Well, how is she? Charming as ever?" "Who?" "You know who I mean, Betty." "That beast! I heard you call her that once when we were at school." And Miss Ellison tittered. "I believe she'll make the whole town swallow the past." "Will she, indeed?" "You don't relish the idea?" "Wait, my dear girl. We have not seen the end of the game yet." End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 33. Roxton, like a certain lady of literary fame, was ever ready with its free opinions on any subject that it did not understand. The return of the Murchisons had exercised the town's capacity for criticism, and inaugurated a debate that was to be heard at public-house bars, as well as in the parlours of the pious. The facts of the case were generally agreed upon, but facts are things that the ingenious mind of man can juggle with. The complexion of the affair varied with the convictions of the debater, and the sacred incidents of home life profaned or honoured according to the temper of the tongue that dealt with them. In Mill Lane The case had a most energetic exponent in the person of Mr. William Baines, the sweep. A certain brewer's drayman, who had won some crude celebrity as an atheist, had taken upon himself to argue on the adverse side. The two gentlemen squared to each other one evening at the bottom of the lane, and thrashed it out strenuously before a meagre but attentive crowd. "What about the inquest? Didn't we read the whole of it in the Mail and Times? You can't get away from facts, can you?" "And supposing he did make a mistake for once, does that mean calling a man a fool and a danger to the public? Who drove his cart last week into a pillar box by Wilson's grocery shop?" Mr. Baines scored a palpable hit. The audience laughed. "Got him there, William," said a neighbour. The drayman sniffed and threw out his stomach. "Facts is facts. Doctoring ain't driving osses." "Thank the Lord, Mr. Sweetyer, it ain't for our sakes." "I say," the man blundered. "And who hasn't run his nose into a lamp-post on occasions? Why, look here," and Mr. Baines stretched out a didactic forefinger. "When my little girl had the diphtheria, who pulled her through? And who saved old Jenny Lowther's leg? And there was young Ben Thompson, who some London joker swore was a dying man." "That's true," said a bony woman in an old red blouse. The drayman, finding the neighbours inclined to take the sweep's view of the matter, began to look hot and a little nettled. "Well, what have you got to say about the booze?" he asked. "I reckon that's more your business than mine." Again the audience caught the jibe and laughed. "3 gallons a day, that's his measure," interjected a morose gentleman who was hanging over his garden gate and smoking the stump of a clay pipe. "Wasn't he carried home from the club?" "P'raps he was, p'raps he wasn't. Any fool could have seen that the man had been working himself to death. Why, he fainted bang off one morning round at our house. Ask my missus. A thimbleful of brandy would have made a man in his state hug the railings." "Anyhow, he hugged 'em," said the obdurate opponent. "We ain't always responsible for what we do when we've had a bad smack over the side of the jaw. Doctors oughtn't to touch it." "You're a nice one to preach now, ain't you?" "He is that," quoth the laconic worthy at the gate. "Look here, don't you go shoving it into me, sideways. Let me argue him, Mr. Cat." "Argue? You ain't got a leg to stand on." "Haven't I, my boy?" And the two disputants began to glare. The drayman wiped his hands on the back of his breeches. "Some fool'll be calling me a liar soon," he remarked. "It's on the cards." "Look here, Bill Baines, I've had enough of your sarce. Stow it. You go and bully your kids. Can't I speak my mind when I bloomin' well like?" "Course he can," said the lady in the red blouse, "and he speaks it well, he does. Murchison was always a right down gentleman. Better than that there little nip of steel." "Right for you, Mrs. Penny. We don't go blackguarding other people's characters, do we?" "I ain't blackguarding them, man. I'm stating facts." "Facts, facts. Why, the man's clean daft on facts. Facts must be another name for a pint of bitter." "I'll smash your jaw, Bill Baines, if you don't stow it." "Smash away, my buck. Who's afraid of a blooming cask?" Whereon the dwellers in Mill Lane were treated to an exhibition of 2 minutes' straight hitting, an exhibition that ended in the intervention of friends. But since the drayman departed with a red nose and a swollen eye, it may be inferred that the sweep had the best of the argument. To have one's past, present, and future dragged through the back streets of a country town is not an experience that a man of self-respect would welcome. A sensitive spirit cannot fail to feel the atmosphere about it. It may see the sun shining, the clouds white against the blue, the natural phenomena of health and of well-being, or the faces of a man's fellows may be as sour puddles to him, their sympathy a wet December. Trite as the saying is, that in trouble we make trial of our friends, only those who have faced defeat know the depth and meaning of that time-worn saying. A week in Roxton betrayed to Catherine and her husband the number and the sincerity of their friends. The instinct of pride is wondrous quick in detecting truth from shams, even as an expert's fingers can tell old china by the feel. The population of the place was soon mapped out into the priggishly polite, the piously distant, the vulgarly inquisitive, the unaffected honest, and the honestly indifferent. Catherine met many a face that brightened to hers in the Roxton streets. The past seemed to have banked more goodwill for them than they had imagined. It was among the poor that they found the least forgetfulness, less of the cultured and polite hauteur, less affectation, less hypocrisy. As for the practice, they found it non-existent that first humiliating yet half-happy week. But perhaps the sincerest person in Roxton at that moment was the wife of Dr. Parker Steel. Betty was not a passionate woman in the matter of her affections, but in her capabilities for hatred she concentrated the energy of 10. She had come quite naturally to regard herself as the most gifted and interesting feminine personality that Roxton could boast. Every woman has an instinctive conviction that her own home and her own children are immeasurably superior to all others. With Betty Steele, this spirit of womanly egotism had been largely centred on herself. She had no children to make her jealous and critical towards other women's children. It was the symmetry of her own success in life that had developed into an enthralling art, an art that absorbed her whole soul. It might have been imagined that she had climbed too high to trouble about an old hate, that she was too sufficiently assured of her own glory to stoop to attack a humbled rival. Jealousy and a sneaking suspicion of inferiority had embittered the feud for her of old, and Kate Murchison, saddened and aged, half a suppliant for the loyalty of a few good friends, could still inspire in Betty a spirit of aggressive and impatient hate. She remembered that she had seen Catherine triumphant where she herself had received indifference and disregard. The instinct to crush this antipathetic rival was as fierce and keen in her as ever. "Call on her," had been Madge Ellison's suggestion. "Call on her!" "It would be more diplomatic." "Do you imagine, Madge, that I am going to make advances to that woman? She used to snub me once. My turn has come. I give the Murchisons just 6 months in Roxton." How little mercy Betty Steele had in that intolerant and subtle heart of hers was betrayed by the strategic move that opened the renewal of hostilities. She had driven Kate Murchison out of Roxton once, and the arrogance of conquest was as fierce in this slim, refined-faced woman as in any Alexander. She moved in a small and limited sphere, but the aggressive spirit was none the less inevitable in its lust to overthrow. The motives were the meaner for their comparative minuteness. Lady Sophia's Bazaar Committee met in Roxton Public Hall one day towards the end of May, to consider the arrangement of stalls and to settle a number of decorative details. Betty had spent half the morning at her escritoire, sorting letters, meditating chin on hand, scribbling on the backs of old envelopes, which she afterwards took care to burn. She seemed in her happiest vein that afternoon as she left Madge Ellison to provide tea for Dr. Little, and drove to the public hall with her dispatch box full of the Bazaar Fund's correspondence. No one would have imagined it possible for such refinement and charm to cover instincts that were not unallied to the instincts found in an Indian jungle. Mrs. Betty went through her business with briskness and precision. The committee left their chairs to discuss the grouping of the stalls about the room. There were to be 12 of these booths, each to represent a familiar flower. Lady Sophia had elected herself a rose. Mrs. Betty's choice had been oriental poppies. Lady Sophia was parading the hall with a pair of pince-nez perched on the bridge of her nose, and a memorandum book open in her hand. A group of deferential ladies followed her like hens about a farmer's wife at feeding time. The most trivial suggestion that fell from those aristocratic lips was seized upon and swallowed with relish. "Betty, dear, have you heard from Jennings about the draperies?" The glory of it to be "my deared" in public by Lady Sophia Gillingham. "Yes, I have a letter somewhere, and a list of prices." "You might pin up the letter and the price list on the black board by the door. so that the stall-holders can take advantage of any item that may be of use to them." Betty moved to the table and rummaged amid her multifarious correspondence. She was chatting all the while to a Miss Cousins, a thin, wiry little woman, alert as a Scotch terrier in following up the scent of favour. "What a lot of work the bazaar has given you, Mrs. Steele." "Yes, quite enough," and she divided her attention between Miss Cousins and the pile of papers. "When is the next rehearsal?" "Tuesday, I believe." "I hear you are a genius of the play." "Am I?" And Betty smiled like an ingenuous girl. "I am most horribly nervous. I always feel that I am spoiling the part. Oh, here's Jennings's letter and the list, I think." She left the two papers lying unheeded for the moment, while she answered Miss Cousins's interested questions on costume. "Primrose and leaf green, that will be lovely." "Yes, so everybody says." Lady Sophia's voice interrupted the gossip. She was beckoning to Betty with her memorandum book. "Betty, can you spare me a moment?" Miss Cousins's sharp eyes gave an envious twinkle. "Shall I pin up the papers for you, Mrs. Steele?" "Would you?" "With pleasure." And Betty swept two sheets of paper towards Miss Cousins without troubling to glance at them, and turned to wait on Lady Sophia. Several guests congregated about the blackboard as Miss Cousins pinned up the letter and the price list with such conscientious promptitude that she had not troubled to read their contents. Had she had eyes for the faces of her neighbours, she might have been struck by the puzzled eagerness of their expression. One elderly committee woman readjusted her glasses, and then touched Miss Cousins with a pencil that she carried. "Excuse me." "Yes?" "There is some mistake, I think." "Mistake?" "Yes, that letter," and the spectacled lady pointed to the blackboard with her pencil. Miss Cousins took the trouble to investigate the charge. The letter was written on one broad sheet in a neat, bold hand. Miss Cousins's prim little mouth pursed itself up expressively as she read. Her brows contracted, her eyes stared. "Good heavens! What's this? I must have taken the wrong letter." She tore the sheet down, pushed past her neighbours, and crossed the room towards Betty Steele. The group about the blackboard appeared to be discussing the incident. Mr. Jennings's list of silks and drapings seemed forgotten. "Mrs. Steele, excuse me." "Yes?" "This letter, there's some mistake. It's the wrong one. I pinned it up, and Mrs. Saker called my attention to the error." "Let me see." Miss Cousins gave her the sheet, intense curiosity quivering in every line of her dog-like face. "Good heavens! How did this get mixed up with my business correspondence?" She looked perturbation to perfection. "Miss Cousins, what am I to do? Has any one read it?" The little woman nodded. "How horrible! I must explain. It must not go any further." Betty hurried across the hall towards the door, hesitated, and looked round her as though baffled by indecision. She knew well enough that inquisitive eyes were watching her. Her skill as an actress, and she was consummately clever as a hypocrite, served to heighten the meaning that she wished to convey. "Lady Sophia." Betty had doubled adroitly in the direction of the amiable aristocrat. "Yes, dear." "Can I speak to you alone?" "What is it?" "Oh, I have done such an awful thing. Do help me. You have so much nerve and tact." "My dear child, steady yourself." "I looked out Jennings's papers. Miss Cousins was chattering to me, and when you called me she offered to pin the things on the board. How on earth it happened I cannot imagine, but a private letter of mine got mixed up with the bazaar correspondence. It must have been lying by Jennings's list, for Miss Cousins, without troubling to read it, pinned it on the board." The perturbed, sensitive creature was breathless and all a-flutter. Lady Sophia patted her arm. "Well, dear, I see no great harm yet." "Wait, it was a letter from an old friend abroad, a letter that contains certain confessions about a Roxton family. What on earth am I to do? Look, here it is. Read it." Lady Sophia read the letter, holding it at arm's length like the music of a song. "Good heavens, Betty, I never knew the man drank. That it had been a habit—" "Don't, Lady Sophia, don't." "You should have been more careful." "I know, I know. I shall never forgive myself. For goodness' sake, help me. You have so much more tact than I." Her ladyship accepted the responsibility with stately unction. "Leave it to me, dear. I can go round and have a quiet talk with all those who happened to read the letter. How unfortunate that the opening sentences should have contained this information. Still, it needed never get abroad." "How good of you." "There, dear, you are rather upset, most naturally so." "I think I had better retreat." "Yes, leave it to me." "Thank you, oh, so much. Tell them not to whisper a word of it." "There will be no difficulty, dear, about that." Betty, white and troubled, added a sharper flavour to the stew by withdrawing dramatically from the stage; and any one wise as to the contradictoriness of human nature could have prophesied how the news would spread had he seen the Lady Sophia voyaging on her diplomatic mission round the hall. Poor Mrs. Steele! Such an unfortunate coincidence! Not a woman easily upset, but believe me, my dear Mrs. So-and-so, it was as much a shock to her as though she had heard the news of her husband. Now I am quite sure this unpleasant affair will go no further. Of course not. I rely absolutely on your discretion." And since the discretion of a provincial town is complex to a degree of an ever-repeated confession, coupled with a solemn warning against repetition, it was not improbable that this froth would haunt the pot for many a long day. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of A Woman Swore by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 34. June is the month for the old world garden that holds mystery and fragrance within its red brick walls. In Lombard Street you would suspect no wealth of flowers, and yet in the passing through of one of those solid, mellow Georgian houses you might meet dreams from the bourne of a charmed sleep. Aloofness is the note of such a garden. It is no piece of pompous mosaic work spread before the front windows of a stockbroker's villa, a conventional colour scheme to impress the public. The true garden has no studied ostentation. It is a charm apart, a quiet corner of life smelling of lavender, built for old books, and memories that have the mystery of hills touched by the dawn. You will find the monk's hood growing in tall campaniles, ringing a note of blue, columbines, fountains of gold and red, great tumbling rose-trees like the foam of the sea, stocks all abloom, pansies like antique enamel-work, clove-pinks breathing up incense to meet the wind-blown fragrance of elder trees in flower. You might hear birds singing as though in the wild deeps of a haunted wood, whose trees part the sunset into panels of living fire. Mary of the plain face and the loyal heart had opened the green front door to a big man, whose broad shoulders seemed fit to bear the troubles of the whole town. He had asked for Catherine and her husband. "They are in the garden, sir." "Alone?" "Yes, only Master Jack." Canon Stensley bowed his iron-grey head under the oriental curtain that screened the passage leading from the hall to the garden. "Thanks, I know the way." The rector of St. Antonia's came out into the sunlight, and stood looking about him for an instant with the air of a man whose eyes were always open to what was admirable in life. A thrush had perched itself on the pinnacle of a yew, and was singing his vesper song, with the broad west for an altar of splendid gold. The chiming of the hour rang from St. Antonia's steeple, half hid by the green mist of its elms. A few trails of smoke rising from the red-brick chimney-stacks alone betrayed the presence of a town. To an old college man such an evening brought back memories of sunny courts, cloisters, and sleek lawns, the ringing of bells towards sunset, the dark swirl of a river under the yawn of bridges that linked gardens to gardens beneath the benisons of mighty trees. Yet the light on Canon Stensley's face was not wholly a placid light. It was as though he came as a messenger from the restless, bickering outer world, a friend whom friendship freighted with words not easy to be said. A glimmer of white under an old cherry-tree showed where Catherine sat reading, with the boy Jack prone on the grass, the Swiss Family Robinson under his chin. Murchison was lying back in a deck-chair, watching the smoke from his pipe amid the foliage overhead. Master Jack, rolling from elbow to elbow, as he thrilled over the passage of the tub-boat from the wreck, caught sight of the Canon crossing the lawn. Catherine was warned by a tug at her skirts, and very audible stage aside. "Look out! Here's old Canon Stensley." "Shh, Jack." "Should like to see him afloat in a tub-boat. Take a big—" A tweak of the ear nipped the boy's reflection in the bud. His father gave him a significant push in the direction of the fruit garden. "See if there are any strawberries ripe." "I've looked twice, Dad." "Oh, no doubt. Go and look again." Canon Stensley's big fist had closed on Catherine's fingers. He was not the conventional figure, the portly, smiling cleric, the man of the world with a benignant yet self-sufficient air. Like many big men, silent and peculiarly sensitive, his quiet manner suggested a diffidence anomalous in a man of 6 feet 2. To correct the impression, one had but to look at the steady blue of the eye, the firm yet sympathetic mouth, the staunchness of the chin. It is a fallacy that lives perennially, the belief that a confident face, an aggressive manner, and much facility of speech necessarily mark the man of power. A courtly person would have remarked on the beauty of the evening, and discovered something in the garden to praise. Canon Stensley was not a man given to pleasant commonplaces. He said nothing, and sat down. Murchison handed him his cigar-case. "Thanks, not before dinner." His habit of silence, the silence of a man who spoke only when he had something definite to say, gave him, to strangers, an expression of reserve. Canon Stensley invariably made talkative men feel uncomfortable. It was otherwise with people who had learned to know the nature of his sincerity. "Hallo, what literature have we here?" He picked up Jack's discarded book, and turned over the pages as though the illustrations brought back recollections of his own youth. As a boy he had been the most irrepressible young mischief-monger, a youngster whom Elisha would have bequeathed to the bear's claws. "Ever a member of the Robinson family, Mrs. Murchison?" Catherine caught a suspicious side-glint in his eye. "I suppose all children read the book." "I wonder how much of the moralizing you remember?" "Very little, I'm afraid." "Nor do I. Children demand life, not moralizing upon life." And the canon scrutinized a picture portraying the harpooning of a turtle, as though he had gloated over that picture many times as a boy. Catherine had caught the glimpse of Mary's white apron signalling for help in some domestic problem. She was glad of the excuse to leave the two men together. The sense of a woman is never more in evidence than when she surrenders her husband to a friend. "Can you spare me half an hour for a talk?" "I am not overburdened with work yet." "Oh, it will come." He turned over the pages deliberately, glancing at each picture. "Your wife looks well." "Yes, in spite of everything." "A matter of heart and pluck." "She has the courage of Cordelia." Canon Stensley put the book down upon the grass. The two men were silent awhile, Murchison lying back in his chair, smoking, the churchman leaning forward a little, with arms folded, his massive face set rather sternly in the repose of thought. "There is something I want to talk to you about." Murchison turned his head, but did not move his body. "Yes?" Don't set me down as a busybody. I think I have a duty to you as a friend. It is a matter of justice." The canon's virtues were of the practical workmanlike order. He was not an eloquent man in the oratorical sense, having far too straightforward and sincere a personality to wax hysterical for the benefit of a church full of women. But he was a man who was listened to by men. Murchison turned half restlessly in his chair. "With reference to the old scandal?" he asked. "Yes." "Something unpleasant, of course. Things that are put about behind one's back are generally unpleasant. It was my wife who discovered the report. Women hear more lies than we do, you know." "As a rule." "I decided that it was only fair that you should know, since slandered people are generally the last to hear of their own invented sins." "Thanks, I appreciate honesty." Canon Stensly sat motionless a moment, staring at the house. Then he rose up leisurely from his chair, reached for one of the branches of the cherry tree, drew it down, and examined the forming fruit. "They say that you used to drink." Murchison remained like an Egyptian Memnon looking towards Thebes. The churchman talked on. "I have heard the same thing said about one or two of my dearest friends. Vile exaggeration of some explainable incident. The report originated from a certain lady who resides over against my church. Her husband is a professional man." He pulled down a second bough, and brushed the young fruit with his fingers to see whether it was set or not. The silence had something of the tension of expense. Murchison knew that his old friend was waiting for a denial. "That's quite true. I drank at one time." A man of less ballast and less unselfishness would have rounded on the speaker, perhaps with an affected incredulity that would have embittered the consciousness of the confession. Canon Stensly did nothing so insignificant. He let the branch of the cherry tree slip slowly through his fingers, put his hands in his pockets, and walked aside 3 paces, as though to examine the tree at another angle. "Tell me about it." There was a pause of a few seconds. "My father drank. Poor old Dad. I'm not trying to shelve the affair by putting it on his shoulders. My father and my grandfather both died of drink. My wife knows. She did not know when we were married. That was wrong. If ever a man owed anything to the love of a good woman, I am that man." Canon Stensly returned to his chair. His face bore the impress of deep thought. He had the air of a man ready to help in the bearing of a brother's burden, not with any bombast and display, but as though it were as natural an action as holding out a hand. "It can't have been very serious," he said. Murchison set his teeth. "A sort of hell while it lasted, a tempting of the devil. Not often, perhaps the worse for that." "Ah, I can understand." "It was when I was overworked." "Jaded." "The wife was something better than a ministering angel. She was a brave woman. She fought for me. We should have won, without that scandal, but for a mad piece of folly I took to be heroism." The churchman extended a large hand. "I'll smoke after all," he said. "Do." Murchison opened his cigar case. Canon Stensly was as deliberate a man wholly at his ease. There was not a tremor as he held the lighted match. "Do you know, Murchison, I appreciate this deeply." He returned the matchbox. "It puts you in a new light to me, a finer light, with that rare wife of yours." Murchison was refilling his pipe, lines of thought crossing his forehead. "When my child died—" "Yes?" "I seemed to lose part of myself. I had crushed the curse then. I don't know how to explain the psychology of the affair, but when she died, the other thing died also." Canon Stensly nodded. "It was what we call dipsomania. I never touched alcohol for years. I had been a fool as a student. At my worst, I only had the crave now and again." "And you are sure? Sure that that curse killed my child, indirectly? Is it strange that her death should have killed the curse? As I trust in God, no. The thrush was singing again on the yew tree, another thrush answering it from a distant garden. Canon Stensley lay back in his chair and smiled. "Stay here," he said quietly. "In Roxton?" "Yes. You have friends. Trust them. There is a greater sense of justice in this world than most cynics allow. I never knew man fight a good fight, a clean uphill fight, and lose in the end." They were smoking peacefully under the cherry tree when Catherine returned. She had no suspicion of what had passed, for no storm spirit had left its torn clouds in the summer air. Her husband's face was peculiarly calm and placid. "Where's that boy of yours, Mrs. Murchison?" "Jack?" "Yes. He was hunting the strawberry beds half an hour ago." "Tell him," and the Canon chuckled, "tell him I am not too big yet for a tub." "Oh, Canon Stensley!" "My dear Mrs. Murchison, I said many a truer thing when I was a boy. Children strike home. To have his vanity chastened, let a man listen to children." The big man with the massive head and the broad British chest had gone. Husband and wife were sitting alone under the cherry tree. "You told him all?" "All, Kate." "And it was Betty? That woman! May she never have to bear what we have borne." Murchison was sitting with his elbows on his knees, his chin upon his fists. "Well, they know the worst, at last," he said grimly. "We can clear for action. That's a grand man, Kate. I shall stay and fight as he would were he in my place." She stretched out a hand and let it rest upon his shoulder. "You are what I would have you be, brave. Our chance will come." "God grant it." "You shall show these people what manner of man you are." End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 35. Dr. Little descended the stairs of Major Murray's house with the alert and rather furtive look of a man who has been for days subjected to the semi-skeptical questions of interested relatives. Parker Steel had attended at the introduction of a third Miss Murray into the world. The whole affair had seemed but the ordinary yearly incident of the great, rambling, florid-faced house, whose windows appeared to have copied its owner's military stare. It was during Dr. Little's regency that Major Murray's wife had developed certain sinister symptoms that had worried the locum tenens very seriously. Concern for his own self-conceit, rather than concern for the patient, characterized Dr. Little's attitude towards the case. The professional spirit, when cultivated to the uttermost end of complexity, becomes an impersonation of the intellectual ego. A thin, acute-faced woman with sandy hair appeared at the dining-room door as Dr. Little reached the hall. This lady with the sandy hair and freckles happened to be the most inquisitive, suspicious, and irrebuffable of sisters that Dr. Little had ever encountered on guard over her brother's domestic happiness. "Good morning." "Damn the woman! Good morning." Miss Murray's attitude betrayed the inevitable catechization. Dr. Little followed her into the dining-room. "And how do you find my sister-in-law this morning, Dr. Little?" Miss Murray had an aggressive, expeditious manner that disorganized any ordinary mortal's sense of self-sufficiency and vain repose. In action her hair seemed to become sandier in color, her freckles more yellow and independent. In speech she reminded the locum tenens of a quick-firing gun whose exasperating detonations numbered so many snaps a minute. "Mrs. Murray is no worse this morning. In fact, I can—" "The temperature?" "The temperature is a little above normal." Dr. Little's distinguished air became 10 times more distinguished. He articulated in his throat, and began to pull on his gloves with gestures of great finality. "Did you notice that reddish rash?" "It is our duty, Miss Murray, to notice such things." "And the throat? It seems very red and angry." "A certain degree of pharyngitis is present." "Well, and what's the meaning of it all, Dr. Little?" "Meaning, Miss Murray? Really?" "There's a cause for everything, I imagine." "Certainly. The problem—" "You admit, then, that there is something problematic in the case, Dr. Little?" "There is a problem in every—" "Of course. But in my sister-in-law's case, that is the matter under discussion." "Pardon me, madam. It is impossible to discuss certain—" "My brother desires something definite. He was obliged to go to town to-day." "I should prefer to give my opinion. Major Murray left instructions that I should wire to his club—" "His club?" "Whether any definite conclusion had been arrived at." The two disputants had been volleying and counter-volleying at point-blank range. Neither displayed any sign of giving ground or of surrender. The Scotch lady's voice had harshened into a slight rasp of natural Gaelic. Dr. Little still fumbled at the buttons of his gloves, his words very much in his throat, his whole pose characteristic of the profession upon its dignity. "It is quite impossible, Miss Murray, for me to discuss this case." The thin lady's pupils were no bigger than pin-heads, so that her eyes looked like 2 circles of hard, blue glass. "Very well, Dr. Little, I must telegraph to my brother that no conclusion has been reached." "Pardon me, that would be indiscreet." "To provide me with a solution." The distinguished gentleman had completed the buttoning of his gloves. "I shall hope to see Major Murray in person to-morrow." "You shall see him, Dr. Little, without fail." The locum tenens conducted a dignified retreat, fully aware of the fact that the sandy-haired lady believed him to be an ignoramus. "Confound the woman! How can I tell her what I think?" he reflected. "It seems to me that there is half a ton of domestic dynamite waiting to be exploded in that house. I hardly relish the responsibility. If matters don't clear in a day or two, I shall wire for Steele. It is his case, not mine." To a much hustled man, whose temper had been chastened by a series of irritating incidents, the picture of a pretty woman smiling up at him from a neat luncheon-table revivified the more sensuous satisfactions of existence. Men who live to eat, smoke, and enjoy the curves of a woman's figure are in the main very docile mortals. The savour of a well-cooked entrée will dispel despair and bring down heaven. Dr. Little sat down with a grieved sigh, unfolded his napkin, and accepted Miss Ellison's sympathy as though it were his just and sovereign due. He still had a vision of freckles and sandy hair, and echoes of an aggressive voice that revived memories of the dame school he had attended when in frocks. "What a morning you must have had! It is nearly 2." "A delightful morning, I can assure you. Excuse me, Miss Ellison, the cover of that magazine you have been reading reminds me of a certain female's hair. Would you mind removing it from sight?" "Is the memory so poignant?" "Poignant? And she has freckles the size of peas! Ugh! I wonder why it is that one's patients always seem to conspire against one by being mulish and irritating all on the same day." "Something in the air, perhaps, poor man." "Poor man it is, I assure you, when you have had a series of cantankerous old ladies to blarney. I wonder if I might have a glass of sherry. Oh, don't bother, let me get it." As though the mere offer absolved him from all further effort, Dr. Little sat still and fed, while Madge Ellison rummaged in the sideboard for the decanter. "How much, a tumblerful?" She bent over him as she poured out the wine, the gold chain she wore dangling against his cheek. "Thanks, 3 fingers. How angelic a thing is woman!" "Even when she has freckles and straw-colored hair?" "Forbear, forbear. Ah, now I began to revive a little." He drank the wine, wiped his moustache, and leaned back in his chair, as though to reflect on the natural philosophy of life. Madge Ellison entered into the system as a pleasing and satisfactory protoplasmic development. To this bachelor, who already showed a tendency to plumpness below the heart, she was bracketed with good wine, ninepenny cigars, and well-cooked dishes, a thing pleasant to look at, and pleasant, perhaps, to taste. "How is Mrs. Steele?" Cutlets and new peas were pushed aside. Dr. Little helped himself generously to sponge custard, his eyes fixed affectionately upon the dish. "I am rather worried about Betty." "Worried?" The bachelor began to look sleek and happy. His outlook upon life changed greatly after a few magical passes with a spoon and fork. "I wish you would go up and see her after lunch." "Anything to oblige a lady who can show no freckles. What is the woe? A cold in the head?" Madge Ellison had returned to her chair, and was rocking it gracefully to and fro on two legs. She might have posed as a living metronome, marking the rhythm for the epicure's busy spoon. "How frivolous you doctors are!" Dr. Little wiped a streak of custard from his moustache with his dinner napkin. "It is my hour of relaxation. Haven't you heard the tale of the two bishops who played leap-frog at the end of a church conference? But, to be serious, what are the symptoms?" "She seems rather feverish, and has a sore throat. I noticed something that looked like herpes on her lip." "Herpes, eh? Will she let me see her?" "I'll run up and ask." "Thanks. Is the paper reposing anywhere?" "Oh, don't bother. On the window sill? Thanks. Much obliged." And he propped the paper against the decanter, and so consoled himself with the happy facility of a bachelor. Betty Steele, in a richly laced dressing-jacket, was sitting up in bed with Persian Mignon in her lap. "Bring the man up, dear, if it will give you any satisfaction. Any news in the town?" Madge Ellison sat down and chatted for 5 minutes, while the cat purred under Betty's hand. "I saw Kate Murchison in Castle Gate this morning." "Alone?" "No, being convoyed by the canoness." Betty Steele's mouth curved into a sneer. "A most respectable connection. Did you see any blue ribbon about?" "You are rather hard on the poor wretches, Betty." "Am I?" And she gave a short, sharp laugh. "Every woman sides with her husband, I suppose. You might rub some scent on my forehead, dear." Dr. Little finished a cigar, and yawned in turn over every page of the paper before ascending to Mrs. Betty's room. Madge Ellison opened the door to him. His shoulder brushed her arm as he entered, quite the professional agag where the patient was a woman and under 50. Dr. Little remained some 15 minutes beside Mrs. Betty's bed. His air of lazy refinement left him by degrees, giving place to the interested and puzzled alertness of the physician. It was the curious nodular swelling on Parker Steele's wife's lip that led him to discover glandular enlargement under her round, white chin. "Hair falling out at all?" he asked casually. "Why refer to a woman's one eternal woe?" "Oh, nothing," and he smiled a little stiffly. "The throat is sore, is it not?" "Yes." "Turn to the light, please. Open the mouth wide and say, 'Ah.'" Yes, rather inflamed." And Dr. Little, after moving his head from side to side, like a man peering down the bowl of a pipe, drew back from the bed, his eyes fixed momentarily on Betty Steele's face with peculiarly intense stare. "I'll send you up a gargle for the throat." "Thanks. I shall be all right for Saturday, I suppose?" "I hope so." "It is the last rehearsal. I must not miss it." "Have you heard from Dr. Steele to-day?" Betty was holding Mignon's head between her two hands, and looking into the cat's yellow eyes. Something in the intonation of Dr. Little's voice seemed to startle her. She glanced up at him with a questioning smile. "I expect him back in a week or so. Madge, get me that letter, dear. I think he said next Wednesday. Is there anything—" Little had moved towards the door. "I only wanted to know the date. I promised some months ago to do some locum work for an old friend this week." Betty had glanced through her husband's letter. She laid it aside when Dr. Little had gone, and took Mignon back into her lap. "That man's worried about something, Madge," she said. "Worried? Not a bit of it, dear." "Why not?" "It's not in the bachelor nature to worry, provided food is plentiful and work slack. Pins wouldn't prick him. They're selfish beasts." "I thought you liked the man, Madge." "The men we flirt with, dear, are not often the men we marry." Meanwhile, Dr. Little had descended the stairs, looking as serious as any middle-aged demigod who had been snubbed by a schoolgirl. He crossed the hall to Parker Steel's consulting room, took out a bottle containing tabloids of perchloride of mercury from the cabinet, dissolved 2 in the basin fixed in one corner of the room, and sedulously and carefully disinfected his hands. "How the devil—" This meditative exclamation appeared to limit the gentleman's reflections for the moment. He stood with bent shoulders, staring at his hands soaking in the rose-tinted water, like some mediaeval wiseacre striving to foresee the future in a pot of ink. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 36. The glitter of the sea visible between the foliage of flowering shrubs seemed to add a touch of vivacity to the June somnolence that hung like a summer mist over the south coast town. Parker Steel, half lying in a basket chair under a red may-tree in the hotel garden, betrayed his sympathy with the poetical paraphernalia of life by reading through a list of investments recommended by his brokers. A satisfactory breakfast, followed by the contemplation of a satisfactory banking account, begets peace in the heart of man. It was about 10 o'clock, and a few enthusiasts were already quarrelling over croquet, when the hotel buttons came out with a telegram on a tray. "Number 25, Dr. Steele?" "Here." "Any reply, sir?" The boy waited, with the tray held over that portion of his figure where his morning meal reposed, while Parker Steel tore open the envelope and read the message. "No answer." "Right, sir. Wait. Tell them at the office to get my bill made up. I have to leave after lunch." "Yes, sir. And bring me a timetable and a whiskey and soda." Parker Steel glanced at his watch, thrust the investment list into the breast pocket of his coat, and lay back again in his chair, with the telegram across his knee. Faces vary much in their expression when the mind behind the face labors with some thought that fills the whole consciousness for the moment. The smooth indolence had melted from the physician's features. His face had sharpened, as faces sharpen in bitter weather, for a man who is a coward betrays his cowardice even when he thinks. A much-grieved croquet-player, in a blue and white checked dress, was confiding her criticisms to a very sympathetic gentleman in one corner of the lawn. "It is such a pity that Mrs. Sallow cheats so abominably. I hate playing with mean people. Every other stroke is a spoon, and she is always walking over her ball, and shifting it with her skirt when it is wired. People give their characters away in games. It is so contemptible. I can't understand any self-respecting person cheating." The continuous click of the balls appeared to irritate Parker Steel, as he sat huddled up in his chair with the telegram on his knee. He found himself listening, without curiosity, to the young lady in the blue and white, whose complaints suggested that the immoral Mrs. Sallow was the cleverer player of the two. Dishonesty is only dishonest, to many people, when it comes within the cognizance of the law, and how thoroughly symbolical those 4 balls were of the opportunities mortals manipulate in life, Parker Steel might have realized, had not his mind been clogged with other things. The boy returned with a timetable and the whiskey and soda on a tray. "A fast train leaves at 2:30, sir." "Thanks. Get me a table. You can keep the change." "Much obliged, sir," and he touched a carefully watered forelock. "Will you drive, sir, or walk?" Order me a cab." "Right, sir." And the boy noticed, as he turned away, that the hand shook that reached for the glass, and that some of the stuff was spilled before it came to the man's lips. No one met Parker Steel at Roxton station that June evening. A porter piled his luggage on a cab, for the physician's own carriage was not forthcoming. A sense of isolation and neglect took hold upon him as he drove through the sleepy streets of the old town. Loneliness is never comforting to a man who is cursed with an irrepressible conscience, and his own restless imaginings rose like a cold fog into the June air. Parker Steel shivered, as he had often shivered when driving through moonlit mists to answer a midnight message. The very elms about St. Antonia's spire had a shadowy strangeness for him, a gloom that gave nothing of the glow of a return home. Parker Steel stood in his own dining-room, waiting and listening, as though he were in a stranger's house. Simons, the starched servant, had opened the door to him without a smile. His luggage had been carried upstairs. He had heard voices, faint, distant voices, that had tantalized him with words that he could not understand. He had been ready to ask the woman Simons a dozen questions, but had faltered from a self-conscious fear of betraying his own thoughts. The house seemed full of some indefinable dread as the dusk deepened towards night. A door opened above. He heard footsteps descending the stairs, so slowly in the silence of the darkening house that the sound reminded the man of the slow drip of water into a well. Parker Steel found himself counting them as they descended towards the hall. If it was Betty, how was he to construe the message of the morning? The suffering of suspense drove him to action. He turned sharply, crossed the room, and opening the door, looked out into the hall. "Hello, dear, is it you?" She was in white, and her foot was on the last step of the stairs. "I am glad you have come, Parker. I had your wire early. I imagined—" "That I was ill?" "Yes, that you were ill." She halted with one hand on the carved foot-post of the balustrading. The dusk of the hall showed nothing but a white figure and a grey oval to mark her face. Some mysterious psychic force seemed to hold husband and wife apart. Their two personalities had become incompatible through some subtle ferment of distrust. "Parker!" He made a step forward. "No, I want you to go into that room and light the gas." The insistent note in her voice repulsed him. His walk approached a self-conscious shuffle as he turned and re-entered the darkening room. Betty heard him groping for the matches. A sudden glare of light followed the sharp purr of a flaring match. She drew a deep and sighing breath, pressed her hands to her breast, and entered the room. Parker Steel was drawing the blinds. His wife closed the door and waited for him to turn. "When I had your wire, dear—" "Yes?" "I wondered what I should find here. The wording. Good heavens, Betty!" She stood back from him and leaned against the sideboard, the glare from the gas falling full upon her face. It was red, repulsive, tinged with ooze that had hardened here and there into yellow scabs. "You see, Parker, why I sent for you." He looked for the moment like a man shocked into immobility by a sudden storm of wind and sleet beating on his face. "When did this appear?" He moved towards her, the shallow gleam of sympathy in his eyes darkened by something more terrible than mere fear. Betty stood her ground. It was the man who betrayed the incoherency of panic. "Come, tell me." His eyes were fixed upon her face, upon her mouth. "It is I, Parker, who want to know." "Yes, yes, of course, dear, I can understand. You should have sent for me sooner." Intuition is a gift of the gods to women, a power, almost unholy in its brilliant reading of the hearts of others. Betty's eyes were searching her husband's face as though it were some delicately finished miniature in which every piece of shading had significance. Her breath came and went more deeply than when life had a normal flow. For all else she was cold, very quiet, the mistress even of her own repulsive face. I want you to tell me, Parker." She saw the muscles about his mouth quiver. "Have you seen anyone?" "Yes." "Who?" "Dr. Little and Dr. Brimley." "Well?" "What?" "They would tell me nothing." "Nothing?" She saw him breathe out deeply like a man who has seen a child escape the wheels of a heavy cart. "They gave me mere phrases, Parker. A woman can tell when men are hiding the truth." "What had they to hide, dear? Come closer, here, to the light." She did not stir. "I must know, Parker." "Yes, of course." "The whole truth. Listen. I happened to go yesterday morning into your consulting room. Dr. Little had been reading. He had left the book open at a certain page. You know, Parker, that many men only read the big textbooks when they are puzzled by a particular case." Steel's face seemed nothing but a gray and frightened mask to her. "Betty, you are imagining things." "Well, tell me the truth." "A form of eczema." "Parker!" Her voice had the ring of iron in it. "That was not the word I read." "Good God, Betty!" "It was this." She spoke the word without flinching, with a distinctness that had the cold and terrible conciseness that science loves. Her eyes did not leave her husband's face. Even as he answered her, hotly, haltingly, she knew him to be a liar. "Impossible! You are seizing on a mad coincidence, a mere ridiculous conclusion. I can swear—" "Yes, swear." "That it is nothing, nothing of what you have said." His eyes had the furtive fierceness of eyes searching her soul for unbelief. "Come, Betty, wife." She remained unmoved. "What, you think that I—" "No, don't touch me. I don't believe that you have told me the truth." "Not believe that I—" "No, God help me, I cannot." Her body had hardly changed the pose that it had taken from the first moment. It was as though it had stiffened with the slow, pitiless hardening of her heart. Parker Steel looked at her like the moral coward that he was, too crushed by his own consciousness of shame to pretend to the courage that he could not boast. "Betty, am I—" She flung aside from him with an indescribable gesture of passionate repulsion. "Don't! I can't look at you, or be looked at. Madge is waiting for me. They will bring you your dinner. Good night." She moved towards the door. "Betty!" He would have hindered her, but the manhood in him had neither the power nor the pride. She swept out and left him. He heard the sound of sobbing as she climbed the stairs. Good God! Parker Steel stood listening, staring at the door. A man who could neither think nor act. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 37. On 2 successive days the society of loafers that lounged outside the gates of Roxton Station for the ostensible purpose of carrying hand-bags and parcels had noticed Major Murray's red-wheeled dog-cart meet the afternoon express from town. The Society of Luggage Loafers boasted a membership of 4. It was not an energetic brotherhood, and had put up a living protest against the unseemly scurry and bustle of 20th-century methods. The society's loafing ground ran along the white fence that closed in the goods yard, a fence that carried, from 4 distinct patches of discoloration, the marks left by the brothers' bodies in their postures of dignified and independent ease. All the comings and goings of Roxton seemed known to these 4 gentlemen, whose eyes were ever on the alert, though their hands remained in their trousers pockets. A fly basking on the sidewalk within 6 feet would be seen and dislodged by a brisk discharge of saliva from between one of the members' lips. Like Diogenes, they had reduced impertinence to a fine art, and the major portion of the society's funds was patriotically disbursed to swell the state's revenue on beer. Psst! Here he is again. Who? A mouth was wiped by the back of a hand. Murray's man. Simon? Yes. Little fellow with the twirly moustache. What d'ye guess he be, Jack? Looks as though he might have come twine the clocks. You bet. To do with the babies, I've heard. Ah, how's that, then? Murray's man, he told me t'other evening. This little feller be what they call a Lunnon special. Dunno what edition. 3 pairs of eyes, one member was absent on duty at the pub, followed Major Murray's dog-cart with an all-engrossing stare as its red wheels whirled by in the June sunshine. Thought Steele had the managing of all Murray's badgers. So he has. Didn't you see him come back by the 7:50 t'other day? I did. And the other feller who's been wearing Steele's breeches all the month went off by the 4:49. He did. Saucy-looking chap. Gimme Jim Murchison and blow the liquor. He tells you what's what, and no mistake. Said I should drink myself to death, and so I shall. What, had the raps again, Frank? Yes, all along with me old liver. Chucks it out of me every morning, reg'lar as clockwork. The observations of the Brotherhood were reliable as far as the identity of the gentleman in Major Murray's dog-cart was concerned. He was named Dr. Peterson, and his caliber may be appreciated by the fact that he received a cheque for 25 guineas when he travelled 40 miles to and fro from his house in Mayfair. Moreover, he had left his card the preceding day on Dr. Parker Steele, with a note urging that an interview between them was urgent and inevitable. Parker Steele's face had betrayed exceeding discomfort and alarm on reading the name on the piece of pasteboard that Dr. Peterson had left on the general practitioner's hall table. It was about 4 o'clock on the afternoon of Thursday when Major Murray's dog-cart clattered over the cobbles of St. Antonia's Square, and deposited a very spruce little man in a well-cut frock-coat and a blemishless tall hat at Parker Steele's door. The imperturbable Simons recognized him as the caller of yesterday. "Dr. Steele's out, sir." "Out? Very sorry, sir. You gave him my card and note?" "Certainly, sir. Will you wait? Dr. Steele should be back at any minute." Dr. Peterson glanced at his watch and stepped like a dapper little bantam into the hall. His reddish hair was plastered from a broad pathway in the middle, so as to conceal the premature tendency to baldness that his pate betrayed. Dr. Peterson's figure boasted a juvenile waist. His face, smooth and very sleek, almost suggested the craft of the beauty specialist. A red and green bandana handkerchief protruded from his breast coat pocket, an aesthetic patch of colour harmonizing with his sage-green tie. He wore black and white check trousers, patent leather boots, and a tuberose in his buttonhole. Moreover, his person smelled fragrantly of scent. Dr. Peterson deposited his hat and gloves on the hall table. "I can spare half an hour. My train goes at 5. It is highly important that I should see Dr. Steele." "I will tell him, sir, the minute he returns." And she showed Dr. Peterson into the drawing-room. A bedroom bell rang as Simons was descending the stairs to the kitchen. She turned with a "Drat the thing!" and dawdled heavenward to her mistress's room. "Who has called, Simons?" "Dr. Peterson, ma'am." "From Major Murray's?" "Yes, ma'am. Wants to see the master, most particular." "Dr. Steele's not in?" "No, ma'am, but he left word that he would be at home about 4. "Thanks, Simons, you can go." The servant's ill-conditioned stare was bitterness to a woman of Betty's pride and penetration. The finer touches of courtesy, the more delicate instincts, are rarely developed in the lower classes. Even the starched Simons is utterly cow-like in her manners. Betty felt her face sore under the servant's eyes. A big red book lay open upon the dressing-table amid Betty Steele's crowd of silver knick-knacks. It was the medical dictionary, and lay open at the London list and at the letter P. Dr. Peterson's name headed the left-hand page, as staff physician to sundry hospitals and charitable institutions, and as a holder of medals, diplomas, and degrees galore. A cursory glance at the titles of his contributions to medical literature would have marked him out as one of the leading authorities on diseases of the skin. Betty Steele looked in her pier-glass, fluffed out her hair a little, and fastening the scarf of her green tea-gown, crossed the landing towards the stairs. She had that steady and almost staring expression of the eyes that betrays a purpose suddenly but seriously matured. She had not spoken with her husband since their meeting on the night of his return. "Dr. Peterson, I believe." The specialist had been reviewing the photographs on the mantelpiece, and had displayed his good taste by electing a handsome cousin of Betty's as his ideal for the moment. He set the silver frame down rather hurriedly, and turned at the sound of the door opening, a dapper, diplomatic, yet rather finicking figure, the figure more of a little man about town than of a brilliant and prosperous London consultant. "Mrs. Steele?" He had glanced up with a slight puckering of the brows into Betty's face. "Yes, I'm sorry my husband is out. I have taken the opportunity, Dr. Peterson, of consulting you." She moved towards the window, graceful, well poised, and unembarrassed. The specialist stood aside, his face a sympathetic blank, a bird-like and inquisitive alertness visible in his eyes. "You have noticed my face, Dr. Peterson." She stood before him unflinchingly, a woman of distinction and of charm of manner despite her great disfigurement. The fingers of Dr. Peterson's right hand were fidgeting with his watch-chain. It was wholly improper for a London consultant to appear embarrassed. "You wish to consult me?" "Yes." He hesitated, elevated his eyebrows, and then met her with a conciliatory smile. "I do not know, Mrs. Steele, whether—" She understood his meaning and the significance of his hesitation. "My husband, yes, your opinion will be of interest to him. Let us be frank." Dr. Peterson advanced one patent leather boot, put the forefinger of his right hand under Betty's chin, and turned her face towards the light. She could see that he was profoundly interested, despite his air of shallow smartness; also that he was somewhat perplexed by the responsibility she had thrust upon him. How long have you noticed the swelling on the lip?" "5 weeks or more. Perhaps longer." "The throat?" She opened her mouth wide. Dr. Peterson peered into it and frowned. "The rash has been present some days?" "Yes." "You are paler than usual?" "I think so." "Feverish?" "A little." "Of course, Dr. Steele has seen all this?" "Yes." He was embarrassed, troubled, and betrayed the feeling in an increased fussiness and polite magniloquence of manner. "You must pardon me, Mrs. Steele." "I want you to be quite frank with me. I am ready to answer any questions. You may think my attitude unusual." "Not at all, not at all." And he flicked his handkerchief from his pocket, and began to polish a lens in a tortoise-shell setting. "I must confess, Dr. Peterson, that I have been subjected to a great deal of worry and doubt. My husband only returned yesterday. Of course you know about that. Dr. Little sent for you to see Major Murray's wife, I believe." Dr. Peterson still flourished his handkerchief. "Has Dr. Steele expressed any opinion to you?" "About this?" "Yes." "He told me that it was a form of eczema." The specialist threw a sharp, penetrating look at her face. "That was your husband's diagnosis?" "I believe it to be incorrect." "Indeed!" "And that he knows that he has not told me the truth." Both heard the rattle of a latch-key in the lock of the front door, and the sound of footsteps in the hall. Symons could be heard hurrying up the stairs from the kitchen. She spoke to someone in the hall, a tired and toneless voice answering her in curt monosyllables. It was Parker Steel. Dr. Peterson walked up the room and back again to the window, glancing rather nervously at the clock as he passed. His attitude was that of a man who has been entangled in the meshes of a very delicate dilemma, and he was waiting to see how Betty Steele's mood shaped. She was standing with one hand resting on the back of a chair, as though steadying herself for the inevitable crisis. "Ah, good day, I must apologize. Betty!" He had entered with an elaborate flourish intended to suggest the brisk candour of a man much hurried in the public service. His wife's figure, outlined against the window, brought him to a dead halt on the threshold. The blood seemed to recede from his face in an instant. The alert, confident manner became a tense effort towards naturalness and self-control. "You will excuse us, Betty. Dr. Peterson and I have matters to discuss." He held the door open for her, but she did not budge. "I am consulting Dr. Peterson, Parker." Her husband's face seemed to grow thin and haggard, with the lights and shadows of the hall for the checkered background. The specialist stood jerking his watch-chain up and down. "I think—" he began. Betty turned to him with the air of a mistress of a salon. "This is a family affair, Dr. Peterson, is it not? There are no secrets that a husband and wife cannot share. I may tell my husband what I believe your opinion to be." "My opinion, madam?" His voice betrayed the rising impatience of a man irritated by finding his discretion taxed beyond its strength. The grim touch of the tragic element banished the veneer of formalism from his face. To pose such a man as Dr. Peterson with a problem in ethics engendered anger and impatience. "I am not aware that I have pledged myself to any expression of opinion." "No," and she smiled, "but I can ask you a blunt question, to which yes or no will be inevitable." The specialist met her eyes, and realized that the subtlety of a woman may make a man's prudence seem ridiculous. He was a rapid thinker, and the complexities of the situation began to shape themselves in his mind. Betty Steel was not a woman whom he would care to hinder with a lie. "You put me in a most embarrassing position." "Believe me, no." "With regard to another case I have some authority to speak." "Consider my case within your jurisdiction." "Betty!" Her husband's face was turned to hers in miserable reproof. "Remember, we are something to each other. I cannot bear—" He faltered as he read the unalterable purpose in her eyes. It is the nature of some women to appear incapable of pity when their self-love has received a poignant shock. "Then, Parker, you admit—" "For God's sake, Betty, let me have 5 minutes' privacy." She looked at him calmly, as though considering his inmost thoughts. "I think Dr. Peterson can deal with you more forcibly than I can. Is it sufficient that we understand each other?" "Have you no consideration for my self-respect?" "It is my self-respect that accuses you in this." And she turned and left the two men together. Chapter 37. Chapter 38 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 38. It was a wet evening in June, and a steady downrush of rain purred the tiled floors of the old town and set the broad eaves and high-peaked gables dripping. A summer sweetness breathed in the gardens, where the fallen petals of rhododendrons lay like flame upon the green grass. The roses were weighed down with dew, and each leaf diamonded with a glimmering tear. In Lombard Street the tall cypresses stood like solemn monks cowled and coped against the rain. The downpour had lessened a little, and Jack Murchison flattened his nose against the nursery window, saw a country cart driven by a man in a white mackintosh swing into Lombard Street from the silver, rain-drenched sheen of St. Antonia's trees. The man's big white body streamed with wet, his face shining out like a drenched peony under the brim of his hat, that dripped like the flooded gutter of a house. Tremulous raindrops fell rhythmically from the big man's nose, and the apron that covered his legs was full of puddles. The country cart drew up outside the doctor's house, and Master Jack saw the big man in the white mackintosh climb out laboriously, the cart tilting under his weight. He threw the leather apron over the horse's loins, and swung the water out of his hat, disclosing to the boy above a round, bald patch about the size of a saucer. The bell rang, a good, rattling, honest peal that told of a straightforward and unaffected fist. Jack heard Mary's rather nasal treble answering the big man's vigorous bass. The white mackintosh was doffed and hung considerately on the handle of the bell. There was much wiping of boots while the man Gage appeared at the side gate in the garden wall, and came forward to hold the farmer's horse. "Sorry to bother you, doctor, on such a beast of an evening." "Come in, Mr. Carrington." "You remember me, sir?" "I don't forget many faces. Come into my study." The doffing of the white mackintosh had uncovered a robust and rather corpulent, thick-set figure in rough tweed jacket and breeches and box-cloth leggings. The farmer had one of those typically solid English faces, fresh-coloured though deeply wrinkled, and chastening its good humour with an alert, world-wise watchfulness in the rather deep-set eyes. Mr. Carrington was considered rather a masterful man by his friends, a man who could laugh while his wits were at work bettering a bargain. He was one of the most prominent farmers in the neighbourhood, and one of the few who confessed to making money despite the times. "My trap's waiting outside, doctor. I want you to come back with me right away to Goldspur Farm." Mr. Carrington was sitting on the extreme edge of a chair, and wiping the rain from his face with a silk handkerchief. "Anything much the matter?" "Well, doctor, you know I have taken to growing a lot of ground fruit, and I've had about 50 pickers down from town this year." Murchison nodded. "They've camped out in 2 tin shanties and a couple of tents down at Goldspur Farm. East Enders, all of them. And you never quite know, doctor, what an East Ender carries. Well, to be frank, I'm worried about some of 'em." Mr. Carrington sat squarely in his chair, and tapped the floor with the soles of his boots. He looked thoughtful, and the corners of his big, good-tempered mouth had a melancholy droop. "There's one woman in particular, doctor, and her youngster, who seem bad, sick and sweating, won't take food, they just lie there in the straw like logs. My foreman didn't tell me anything about it till this afternoon, but when I'd seen the woman I had the horse put in and came straight here." Murchison glanced at his watch, and then crossed the room and rang the bell. "Can you have me driven back?" he asked. "Certainly, doctor." "Good. Mary, will you ask your mistress to have dinner postponed till 8, and tell Gage to take these letters to the post. Now, Mr. Carrington, my mackintosh and I are at your service." "You'll need it, doctor, and an old hat." A slender vein of gold gashed the dull west as they left the outskirts of the town behind. As the rent in the sky broadened, long rays of light came down the valley, making the woods and meadows a glory of shimmering green, and firing the rain pools so that they shone like brass. The farmer took the private road that ran through Ulverston Park, a rolling wilderness of beeches and Scotch firs, whose green rides plunged into the glimmering rain-splashed umbrage of tall trees. Here were tangled banks of purpling heather, and great stretches of sweet woodland turf. Old yews brooded in the deeps of the domain, solemn and still, most ancient and wise of trees. "Get up, Molly." And Mr. Carrington shook a raindrop from his nose, and flicked the brown mare with the whip. "Clearing a little. Sorry for the people who cut their hay yesterday." "Somewhat damp. How's the fruit doing?" "Oh, pretty fair, as far as our strawberries are concerned. The finest year, doctor, is when you have a first-class crop and your neighbours can only put up rubbish. It's no good every one being in tip-top form. I've got rid of tons, and at no dirt price either." Mr. Carrington's British face beamed slyly above his angelic white mackintosh. It was a face in which stolid satisfaction and stolid woe were easily interchanged, for the heavy lines thereof could be twisted into either expression. Murchison was listening to the hoarse rattle of the clearing shower beating upon a myriad leaves. The gold band in the west was broadening into a canopy of splendour. Had Mr. Carrington been educated up to more pushing and aggressive methods of making money, he would have seen in that sky nothing but a magnificent background for some silhouetted sky sign shouting, "Try our jam." "And these pickers of yours, how long have they been with you?" The lines in the farmer's face rearranged themselves abruptly. "Poor devils, they look on this as a sort of yearly picnic, doctor. There are about 50 of them, and they've been at Goldspur about 10 days. Many children? Children? Plenty. If they were Irish, they'd bring the family pig out, doctor, just to give them some new sort of dirt to wallow in. But then what can you expect? What can you expect? They had left the park by the western lodge, and came out upon a stretch of undulating fields, closed in the near distance by woods of oak and beech. A tall gabled farmhouse of red brick rose outlined against the sky, with a great fir topping its chimney stacks like the flat clouds seen above a volcano in full eruption. Near it, fronting the road, were a few nondescript cottages, farther still a jumble of barns, outhouses, and stables. In the middle of a 14-acre field Murchison could see 2 zinc-roofed sheds and a couple of old military tents standing isolated in a waste of sodden, dreary soil. Mr. Carrington pointed to them with his whip. "There's the colony. Will you come in first, doctor, and have—" he considered the words and cleared his throat, "and have a cup of tea?" Murchison had noticed the break in the invitation, and had reddened. "No, thanks. We had better walk, I suppose." "Sit light, doctor. We have a sort of road, though it ain't exactly Roman." The farmer passed Murchison the reins, and climbed down, the trap swaying like a small boat anchored in a swell. He opened a gate leading into the field, his white mackintosh flapping about his legs. "Not worth while getting up again," he said laconically. "Drive her on, doctor. I'll follow." Murchison heard the click of the gate and the squelch of Mr. Carrington's boots in the mud, as the trap bumped at a walking pace towards the zinc sheds in the field. The larger of the two resembled a coach-house, and could be closed at one end by 2 swinging doors. The rain was still rattling on the roof as Murchison drove up, and a thin swirl of smoke drifted out sluggishly from the darkness of the interior. The 2 tents had a soaked and slatternly appearance. Empty bottles, old tins, scraps of dirty paper, and miscellaneous rubbish littered the ground. On a line slung between 2 chestnut poles 3 dirty towels were hanging, either to wash or to dry. As the trap stopped at the end of the rough road, Murchison could see that the larger shed was like a big hutch full of live things crowded together. A litter of straw, ankle deep, lay round the walls. A fire burned in the middle of the earth floor. The faces that were lit up by the light from the fire were coarse, quick-eyed, and hungry, the faces seen in London slums. Half a dozen children scuttled out like a litter of young pigs, and stood in the slush and rain, staring at the trap. Murchison's appearance on the scene seemed to arouse no stir of interest among the adult dwellers in the shed. They stared, that was all, 1 or 2 breaking the silence with crude and characteristic brevity. "Hallo, here's the doctor." "There's air." "Look at the old boss, with a fizz like a round of raw beef stuck on top of a sack of flour." Mr. Carrington arrived with his boots muddy and the lines of his face emphatic and authoritative. "Someone hold the mare. Why don't you keep the kids in out of the wet? This way, doctor, the second tent." Mr. Carrington opened the flap, and letting Murchison enter, contented himself with staring hard at 2 figures lying on an old flock mattress, with a coat rolled up for a pillow. One was a woman, thin, still pretty, in a hollow-cheeked hectic way, with a ragged blouse open at the throat, and a couple of sacks covering her. The other was a child, a girl with flaxen hair tossed about a flushed and feverish face. The child seemed asleep, with half an orange sucked to the pulp, clutched by her grimy fingers. Murchison remained for perhaps half an hour in that rain-soaked tent, while Mr. Carrington stumped up and down impatiently, kicking the mud from his boots and eyeing the rubbish that marked the presence of these London poor. The eastern sky was filling fast with the oblivion of night when Murchison emerged. The woman had been able to answer his questions in a dazed and apathetic way. Mr. Carrington met him with a squaring of his sturdy shoulders and a bluff uplift of the chin. "Well, doctor, I'm glad you sent for me." "As bad as that, is it?" "Typhoid, or I'm much mistaken." The farmer thrust his hands into the side pockets of his mackintosh, and flapped them to and fro. "Well, I'm damned," was all he said. The cold sky rose dusted with a few stars in the west when the farmer's cart set Murchison down in Lombard Street before his own door. Dinner had been waiting more than an hour. Catherine's face, bright yet a little troubled, met him in the shaded glow of the hall. "You must be soaked to the skin, dear," and she felt his clothes. "No, nothing much. I'm more hungry than wet." "A long case. Dinner is ready." They went into the dining-room together, Murchison's arms about her body. "Some responsibility for me at last," he said quietly. "I believe it is typhoid." "Where? At Goldspur Farm?" "Yes, among Carrington's pickers." "Poor things." "They are cooped up like cattle in a shed." He was silent for some minutes, for Mary had set a plateful of hot soup before him, and even doctors are sufficiently human to enjoy food. "There is a child ill," he said, staring at the bowl of roses in the middle of the table. "Poor little thing." "Strange, Kate, but she reminds me wonderfully, very wonderfully, of Gwen." End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of A Woman Swore by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 39. It was on the second morning following his interview with Dr. Peterson that Parker Steel received 2 letters heralding the shadow of an approaching storm. "I have laid the facts of the case," wrote the demigod from Mayfair, "before the General Medical Council. I consider this action of mine to partake of the nature of a public duty, for your abuse of your position has been too gross even for medical etiquette to cover. I cannot understand how a practitioner of your reputation could be so mad as to run so scandalous a risk. That you contracted the disease innocently in the pursuit of duty would have won you the sympathy of your fellow practitioners. Your concealment of the disease puts an immoral complexion on the case. Needless to say, I have given Major Murray the full benefit of an honest opinion." Such a letter from a physician of Dr. Peterson's standing would have been sufficient in itself to demoralize a man of more courage and tenacity than Parker Steel. The curt declaration of war that reached him from Major Murray by the very same post exaggerated the effect that the specialist's letter had produced. "Sir, I have received from Dr. Peterson a statement that convicts you of the most scandalous malpraxis. Needless to say, I am placing the matter in the hands of my solicitor. I consider it to be a case deserving of publicity, however repugnant the atmosphere surrounding the affair may be to me and mine. Murray." Those who have touched the realities of war will tell you that they have seen men with faces pinched as by a frost, their teeth chattering like castanets, even under the blaze of an African sun. It was at the breakfast table that Parker Steel read those 2 ominous letters. The man looked ill and yellow, and his nerves were none too steady, to judge by the way he had gashed himself in shaving. The very clothes he wore seemed to have grown creased and shabby in a week, as though they felt the wearer's figure limp and shrunken, and had lost tone in consequence. It may be remembered that the immortal 3 displayed varying symptoms when at grips with death. The tongue of Orthoris waxed feverishly profane. The Yorkshireman broke out into song. Mulvaney the Paddy was incontinently sick. Parker Steel emulated the Irishman in this eccentricity that morning, save that his nausea was inspired by panic, not by heroic rage. Shaken and very miserable, he sat down at the bureau in his consulting-room, leaned his head upon his hands, and shivered. For 2 nights he had had but short snatches of sleep, brief lapses into oblivion that had been rendered vain by dreams. The imminent dread of 100 ignominies had held him sick and cold through the short darkness of the summer nights. Dawn had come and found him feverish and very weary. To a coward it is torture to be alone with his own thoughts. The 3rd night he had taken sulphonal, a full dose, and had slept till Symons knocked at his bedroom door. The fog of the drug still clung about his brain as he sat at the bureau and tried to think. He seemed incapable of putting any purpose into motion, like an exhausted battery whose cells have been drained of their electric charge. Parker Steel picked up a pen after he had crouched there silently for some 20 minutes. He opened a drawer, drew out several sheets of note-paper, and began to scribble confused, jerky sentences, to alter, to reconsider, and to erase. The power to determine and to act, even on paper, were lost to him that morning. He wrote 2 letters, only to tear them up and scatter the pieces in the grate, where a lighted match set them burning. He was still on his knees, turning over the charred fragments, when the door-bell rang. The sedate Symons came to announce a patient. "Mrs. Prosser, sir." "Tell her I can't see her." Symons stared. Her master had something of the air of an angry dog. "Tell her I'm busy. She can call again." "Yes, sir." She still stood in the doorway, irresolute, surprised. "What the devil are you waiting there for, Symons?" "Nothing, sir." And she withdrew, with her dignity balanced on the tip of a very much tilted nose. Parker Steel opened the window wide, and leaning his hands on the sill, looked out into the garden. It was air that he needed, air amid the stifling complexities of life that were crowding tumultuous upon his future. The garden, with its sumptuous serenity of its trees and flowers, had no sympathetic touch for him in his agony of isolation. It was his loneliness that weighed upon him heavily at that moment. He had outlawed himself, as it were, from the heart of his own wife. The very house was a pest-house, in which 2 stricken souls were sundered and held apart. If Betty would only see him! If she could only bring herself to understand that he had acted this disastrous part in order to retain the social satisfactions that she loved. Any companionship, even the companionship of a half-estranged wife, seemed preferable to the isolation that he felt deepening about him. He argued that it was his realization of Betty's ambition that had made him dissemble for her sake. Any argument, however suspicious, is pressed into the service of a man whose whole desire is to justify himself. Unfortunately, when a woman's trust has been once shocked from its foundations, no buttressing and underpinning can save that superstructure of sentiment that has taken years to build. Betty had kept to her room, with no one but Madge Ellison to give her sympathy and advice. The husband had always found the friend embarrassing with her presence any rapprochement between him and his wife. As he stood at the open window, with the words of the 2 letters he had read weaving a hopeless tangle of bewilderment in his brain, he heard someone descend the stairs and go out by the front door into the square. Parker Steel realized that this ubiquitous and embarrassing friend had left Betty alone in the room above. There was some chance, at last, of his seeing her alone, and of attempting to break down the barrier of her reserve. He climbed the stairs slowly, and stood listening for several seconds on the landing before turning the handle of his wife's door. The door was locked. Parker Steel frowned over the ineptitude of the manoeuvre. A dramatic entry might at least have given him some dignity to the trick. As it was, he felt like a sneaking boy who had been balked and taken in some none too honourable artifice. "Betty?" "Yes, what is it?" She was in a chair near the window, reading, with her dark hair spread upon her shoulders. Her mouth hardened as she recognized her husband's voice. It was the very day, and she remembered it, the day of Lady Sophia's fashionable bazaar, when Betty Steele had foreseen the people of Roxton at her feet. She had asked Madge Ellison to bring out the dress that she should have worn. Primrose and leaf green, it hung across the footrail of her bed. "I want to speak to you, Betty. Is there anything that we can discuss?" The level tenor of her voice, its unflurried callousness, gave him an impression of obstinate estrangement. "Betty—" She did not answer. "Let me in, if you will only give me a chance to justify myself." The very words he chose were the words least calculated to move a woman. Betty, lying back in her chair, pictured to herself a cringing, deprecating figure that could boast none of the passionate forcefulness of manhood. A woman may be won by courage and strength, even in the person of the man who has done her wrong. But let her have the repulsion of contempt, and her instinct towards forgiveness will be frozen into an unbending pride. "I do not wish you to make excuses, Parker." "But, Betty—" "Well?" "It was for the sake of the home, the practice, everything. Can't you understand? Can't you imagine what I have gone through?" Her momentary silence seemed to suggest a sneer. "So you would justify a lie? Betty, don't talk like this. I am worried to death by other matters as it is." "I can understand that perfectly." He began to pace the landing, halting irresolutely from time to time before the locked door. "I have heard from Peterson this morning." No reply. "He is reporting the matter to the General Council, and he has given the truth away to Murray. You know what that must mean." Still no reply. "Betty—" Had he been able to see the cynical smile upon her face, Parker Steel might have understood that, by acting the suppliant for her pity, he only intensified her contempt. "Betty, is this fair to me?" He shook the door with a sudden gust of petulant impatience. "Show me a little consideration. I have some right to demand—" "Demand what you please, Parker, but oblige me by not making so much noise." "You will regret this." His voice was harsh now and beyond control. "I have regretted much already." "Your marriage, I suppose." "There is no need, Parker, to indulge in details." "This is beyond my patience." "And mine, I assure you." He turned and retreated from the attack at the same moment that Madge Ellison reappeared upon the stairs. They passed each other without a word, the woman clear-eyed and uncompromising, the man gliding close to the wall. Madge Ellison found Betty sitting with closed eyes before the open window, the June sunshine dappling the bosoms of the tall trees in the square with gold. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of A Woman Swore by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 40. The month was August, and August at its worst, a month of glare and dust, and an atmosphere more trying to the temper than all the insolent bluster of a bragging March. Mr. Carrington, in his shirt-sleeves and white linen sun-hat crowned down over his eyes, stood under the acacia tree at his garden gate, chatting to the Reverend Peter Burt, curate of Cossington, who had tramped 3 miles to visit some of the sick people on the farm. Mr. Burt was rather a shy little man, very much in earnest, and very much convinced of the responsibility of his position. "All this must have been a great worry to you," said the clergyman, with a comprehensive sweep of an oak stick. "Worry? Don't talk of it, sir. What with the heat, and the medical officer of health, And the sanitary inspector. I've been pretty near crazy. I don't know what I should have done, Mr. Burt, but for Murchison and his good lady. Mrs. Murchison seems to have been a local Florence Nightingale. Mr. Carrington stared. I don't happen to know the woman's name, he said, but she must have been a good un, Mr. Burt, to be showed in the same class as the doctor's lady. Why— And the farmer withdrew his hands from his pockets and tapped his left palm with his right forefinger. Why, do you know what she did when she'd been over here and seen how we were fixed? Mr. Carrington paused expressively and looked the young clergyman in the face, as though defying him to conceive the nature of this unique woman's genius. No, I have not heard. Well, Mr. Burt, there's religion and there's religion. Some of us wear black coats on a Sunday and put silver in the plate. Some of us aren't so regular and respectable, but we play the game, and that's more than many of your sitting pew hens do. Excuse me, sir, I'm rather rough in the tongue. Well, Mrs. Murchison, she doesn't strike you as a district visiting sort of lady to look at. She's got a fine face and a head of hair, like the Countess of Camber, who gave the prizes away at our agricultural show last season. Well, Mr. Burt, she came over here and saw what sort of a fix we were in. 2 grumbling nurses and not much more than straw and sacking. Well, what does she do but take one of my wagons and my men and go off to Roxton all on her own. Mr. Carrington paused for breath, took off his sun-hat and wiped his forehead with it, his eyes remaining fixed emphatically on the curate's face. And what do you think, sir? Back came that wagon of mine, loaded up with linen and basins and crockery, a bed or 2, and God knows what. She'd ransacked her own house, sir, and gone round to all the neighbours begging like a papist. Get the stuff? She did that. Not easy to say no to a woman with a face and a voice like hers. Carmagee joined in, and Canon Stensley, and a good score more. And dang my soul, Mr. Burt, she'd been working with her husband here, day in, day out, and that's the sort of thing, sir, that I call religion. The curate began to look vaguely uncomfortable under the farmer's concentrated methods of address. It took much to move Mr. Carrington to words, but when once moved, the result resembled the eruption of a long quiescent volcano, the vigour of the eruption corresponding roughly to the length of the period of quiescence. I quite agree with you, Mr. Carrington, he said, with a certain boyish stiffness, as though he considered it superfluous for the farmer to condemn his soul to perdition. You must excuse my language, Mr. Burt. When I get worked up over a subject, I must let fly. And it's these dirty lies that have been flying abroad about this good lady's husband that have made me hot, sir, to see justice done. Mr. Burt appeared interested by the windows of the house that glimmered from amid a mass of creepers, like water shining through the foliage of trees. One hears very curious rumours, he acknowledged with a discreet frown. I suppose you've heard them over at Cossington? Well, I have heard reports. About our doctor here and the drink? Mr. Burt nodded. But I don't think anyone believed them, he confessed. The farmer's right forefinger began to tap his left palm again. Look here, sir, I ought to know something about Dr. Murchison's character, I imagine. The man's been here nearly a month, living in my house and working like a Trojan. We've had nearly 60 cases, what with the pickers and our own people. You haven't seen what the doctor's been through in this little epidemic of ours, Mr. Burt, and I have. You get to the bottom of a man's nature when he's working 18 hours out of the 24, doing a nurse's jobs as well as his own, and feeding some of the kids with his own hands. I've seen him come into my parlour, sir, at night, and go slap off to sleep on the sofa, he was that done. And never, not on one single blessed occasion, have I seen that man show the white feather or touch a drop of drink. Mr. Burt appeared to become more and more embarrassed by being stared at vehemently in the face, as the farmer's right fist smacked the points of his argument into his left palm. He had to return Mr. Carrington's stare, eye to eye, as a pledge of sincerity. He began to fidget, to scan the horizon, and to fumble with his watch-chain. "Your evidence sounds conclusive," he said. "I think it is time I—" Mr. Carrington ignored the little man's restiveness, and came and stood outside the gate. "Now, I make it a rule in life, Mr. Burt, to take people just as I find 'em, and not to listen to what all the old women say. The rule of a practical man, you understand. Now—" The curate cast a flurried glance up the road, and pulled out his watch. "You really must excuse me, Mr. Carrington." "In a hurry, are you? Well, I was only going to say that some of us people have come by a shrewd notion how all this chaff got chucked about in these parts. Murchison was a first-class man, and some people got jealous of him and played a low-down game to get him out of the town. You take my meaning, Mr. Burt?" "Yes, certainly. Good heavens, it is nearly 12. I really must say good-bye, Mr. Carrington. I hope—" "One moment, sir. I won't mention any name, but perhaps you are just as wise as I am. And what's more, Mr. Burt, from what I've heard, that gentleman that we know of has just been treated as he tried to treat a better man than himself. It was his wife, they say." "Excuse me, Mr. Carrington, but someone is calling you, I think." "They can wait. Now—" "To be frank with you, Mr. Carrington, I can't." "Oh, well, sir, if you are in such a hurry, I'll postpone my remarks. I was only going to say—" But Mr. Burt gave him a wave of the hand and fled. A girl of 17 came down the path from the house between the standard roses, her black hair already gathered up tentatively at the back of a brown neck, and the smartness of her blouse and collar betraying the fact that she considered herself a mature and very eligible woman. "Dad, are you deaf?" Mr. Carrington turned with the leisurely composure of a father. "What's all this noise about, Nan?" "I've been calling you for 5 minutes. They're all there in the 14-acre. "Who?" "Why, Mrs. Murchison, and the Canon, and old Lady Gillingham, and half a dozen more. Dr. Murchison sent one of the boys over for you." Mr. Carrington began to hustle. "Dang it, I expected them tomorrow." "What a man you are, Dad!" And she stood like an armed angel of scorn in the middle of the path. "You can't go and see them in your shirt sleeves." "Bless my soul, Nan, where's my coat?" "On the fence. You were talking to Mr. Burt long enough to forget it. Why didn't you bring him in?" Mr. Carrington was struggling into his alpaca coat, his daughter watching his contortions with the superior serenity of 17. "Bring who in?" "Mr. Burt. The little man's as shy as a calf." "Perhaps you talked him silly. Look here, my dear, it's too hot to argue. Is my tie proper?" His daughter regarded him with critical candor. "It will do," she answered resignedly, as though her father's ties were beyond all promise of salvation. The camp of the fruit-pickers in Mr. Carrington's 14-acre stood out like a field hospital under the August sun. There were half a dozen white tents pitched near the 2 sheds, and on an ingenious framework of poles an awning had been spread so that the convalescents could be brought out to lie in the shade and gain the maximum amount of air. The whole place looked trim and clean, and a faint perfume of some coal-tar disinfectant permeated the air. Mr. Carrington, as he emerged from the orchard gate, saw quite a representative gathering moving through the camp. Several of the Roxton celebrities who had subscribed to the relief fund had been invited by Porteous Carmagee, the treasurer, to drive over and see how the money had been spent. The farmer recognized Lady Gillingham's carriage and pair waiting in the roadway beyond the white field gate, and Cannon's landau had drawn up deferentially behind it, while Mrs. Murchison's pony, that drew her governess' car, was being held by one of the pickers who had lost 2 children but a week ago. Lady Sophia appeared to be holding quite a state inspection, for she had Murchison in his white linen jacket at one elbow, and the Canon in his black coat at the other. She was making considerable use of her lorgnette, a very affable, commonplace, and well-meaning great lady, who felt it to be a most Christian condescension on her part to drive out and examine this temporary hospital and its London poor. Catherine Murchison and Mrs. Densley were talking to one of the women lying under the awning. The treasurer had remained judiciously in the background, and was snapping away to three Roxton ladies who appeared to be fascinated by some subject foreign to enteric fever and pickers of fruit. Porteous Carmagee looked very much amused. A thin little lady in a hat far too big for her, giving her an indistinct resemblance to a mushroom, was attempting to draw more definite information from the lawyer by the feminine pretence of unbelief. "But are you sure, Mr. Carmagee? It may only be a rumour. One hears so many extraordinary things." "I am perfectly sure, madam. There are facts, however, that cannot well be discussed." The suggestion of mystery lent a double glamour to Porteous Carmagee's information. "Then he has left the town for good?" "I think I may swear to that as a fact." "And alone?" "Quite alone." "But surely his wife—" Mr. Carmagee tightened up his mouth and stared reflectively into space. "Don't ask me to unravel the complexities of other people's households, Mrs. Blount." "But how extraordinary! Of course every one knows that she is ill." "Every one knows a great deal more of one's private affairs, madam, than one knows one's self." The three ladies exchanged glances. They formed three spokes of curiosity, with Mr. Carmagee for the hub. "And no one has seen Betty Steele for some weeks." "That is so." "And it is rumoured—" "Then you have heard that too?" "What, my dear?" "That it is an affection of the skin." The lawyer extricated himself from the group, and moved to where Catherine's golden head shone Madonna-like over the face of a little child. "Affection of tom-cats," quoth he under his breath. "It is curious the way these women play with a piece of scandal like a cat with a mouse. It mustn't die, or half the zest of the game would be gone. Catherine, my friend, you are different from the rest." During these digressions, Mr. Carrington had brought himself within the ken of Lady Gillingham's lorgnette. It appeared to the farmer that the great lady's eyes were fixed critically upon his tie. His right hand blushed as he remembered that there was a 3-inch rent there in the seam of his alpaca coat. Such is the judgment that overtakes those who are mistaken as to dates. "Good morning, Mr. Carrington. We are admiring how beautifully you have managed everything for these poor people. So clean and so airy. I am sure you must have suffered a great deal of inconvenience and worry." Mr. Carrington blushed. Porteous Carmagee, who was watching the drama from a distance, felt for Mr. Carrington a species of ironical pity. The farmer's boots described an angle of 90 degrees with one another, and the vehement smirk upon his face made the redness thereof seem dangerously sultry. "We have all been so interested, Mr. Carrington." "Very good of your ladyship, I'm sure." "I sent you an iron bedstead, you may remember. I hope it has been of use." "Great use, your ladyship." "Ah, that is right. And is your family quite well, Mr. Carrington? I hope none of you have contracted the disease." "Only my youngest boy, your ladyship. But Dr. Murchison soon had him in hand." "Ah, quite so. Good day, Mr. Carrington." And she relieved him from the splendour of her notice, and turned to Murchison, who was waiting at her elbow. "What a noble profession, the physician's, Dr. Murchison." The big brown-faced man smiled, and his eyes wandered unconsciously in the direction of his wife. "It has its responsibilities," he said, "and also its compensations." Lady Sophia waved her lorgnette to and fro, and beamed to the extent of the 5-guinea cheque she had contributed to the relief fund. She was wondering whether it was possible that this quiet, clear-eyed man could ever have been the victim of such a thing as drink. If so, then he was to be pitied and not abused. "It must be so gratifying, Dr. Murchison, to save the life of a fellow being." "Yes, it is something to be grateful for." "How well your wife looks! I hear she has been working here, like any trained nurse." Catherine, dancing a doll before the thin little hands of a child of 4, was serenely oblivious to the great lady's praise. Porteous Carmagee was watching her, smiling, and rattling his keys in his pocket. "Your wife is very fond of children, Dr. Murchison." He looked into the distance, and then at the laughing girl of 4. "She lost a child, and that means much to a woman." "Ah, of course, undoubtedly. Poor little creature." And her ladyship tended benignantly in the direction of the awning. Canon Stensly and Murchison were left alone together by one of the tents. A man was delirious within it, and they could hear the meaningless patter of fever flowing in one monotonous tone. "A doctor's life is no sinecure," and he stroked his firm, round chin. "No, perhaps no. We walk daily at the edge of a precipice, and yet it has great compensations." They were silent a moment, watching Lady Sophia trying to coquette with a rather overpowered child. "You have heard about Steele?" "Yes, my wife told me." "One of those strange fatalities we meet with in life, and yet I think there was something of the nature of a judgment in it." "Possibly. I am sorry for the woman." "Then you are magnanimous." "No, I have learned the true values of life. When one has suffered, one loses the meaner impulses." "That is so." "And remains thankful for what one has." "For what one has." And Murchison's eyes were smiling towards his wife. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 41. Betty Steele sat alone at the open window of her room one evening as the sun went down over the red roofs of the old town. Lying back in her chair with her head on a cushion of yellow silk, she could see nothing of the life in the square below, but only the tops of the elm trees, the black spire of the church, and an infinite expanse of cloud-barred sky. The west stood one great splendor of scarlet and of gold. Above, at the zenith, the clouds were bathed in a radiance of auriferous rose. A cold chalcedony blue held the eastern arch, where the purple rim of the night merged into the amethystine shadows of the woodland hills. Betty Steele was alone, save for the cat Mignon, curled up asleep in her mistress's lap. Half covering the cat was a crumpled letter, a letter that had been read and re-read by eyes that were blind to the pageant of the summer sky. She stirred now and again in her chair and shivered. The evening seemed cold to her despite all this chaos of color, this kindling of the torches of the west. The house, too, had an empty silence, like a lonely house where death had been and set a seal upon its lips. Betty lifted Mignon from her lap, rose, crossed the room, and rang the bell. She took a crimson opera cloak from a wardrobe in the corner, flung it across her shoulders, and returned to her chair, with the crumpled letter still in her hand. "Yes, ma'am." A white cap and apron were framed by the shadows of the landing. "Is Miss Ellison back yet, Simons?" "No, ma'am. She said—" "Listen, isn't that the front door?" "Yes, ma'am. Will you ask her to come up to me here?" The white cap and apron vanished into the shadows. Betty, lying back in her chair, looked vacantly at the paling sky, with the blood-red cloak deepening the darkness of her hair. The cat Mignon sprang into her lap. Dreamily, and as by habit, she began to stroke the cat, while listening to the murmur of the two voices in the hall below. Brisk footsteps ascended the stairs, with the swish of silk, and the soft sighing of a woman's breath. "Here I am, dear, at last." "Shut the door, Madge." "I missed my train. You must have wondered what had happened." "I have ceased to wonder at anything in life." Madge Ellison looked curiously at Betty lying back in her chair, and crossed the room slowly, unbuttoning her gloves. "You sound rather down, dear. What's that? Have you heard—" Betty Steele's hand closed spasmodically upon the crumpled letter that she held. Her face was hard and reflective in its outlines, and yet in the eyes there was a pathos of unrest, the unrest of a woman whose gods have left her utterly alone. "I have heard from Parker." Madge Ellison threw her gloves on the bed, unpinned her hat, and waited. "He is leaving England." "Leaving England?" "Yes, for the Cape." "And you?" "My own mistress, to do anything that I please." She gave a curious little laugh, and began straightening out the letter on her knee, looking at it with eyes that strove to make cynicism cover the wounded instincts of her womanhood. "Of course, he does not care. He was afraid to face things." "The coward!" Madge Ellison bent over her, and laid one hand along her cheek. "And he has left you here?" "I suppose he thought there was nothing else to do. He says," and she still smoothed the creased letter under her hand, "you have your own money to live on. The practice is worth nothing under the circumstances. I should advise you to let the house. You cannot afford to live in it on £200 a year." "Is that all you have?" "My father left it me." "Wise father!" "I never thought, Madge, I should value £200 so much." Mignon, who still possessed some of the kittenish spirit of her youth, rolled over in Betty's lap, and began to clutch at the letter with her paws. There was something pathetic in the way the wife suffered that scrap of paper to be a plaything for her pet. "Then he says nothing, dear?" "Nothing? About your joining him?" Betty's lips curled into a cynical smile. "Why should he?" "But surely—" "It was I who broke the ties between us. I think I hated him. He had so little manliness and strength." Madge Ellison lifted up her face to the fading sky. She was serious for one occasion in her life, a woman touched by the realism of life's tragedies. "Can you never—" "Don't ask me that, Madge." "You'll be well soon, your old self. It is only temporary." "I know." "Then—" "If it were only skin deep. But it is deeper, deep to the heart." The confidante gave a sad shrug of her shapely shoulders. "Don't say that yet," she said. "You might repent it." "You think so?" "I don't know what to think." The sky had darkened. The clouds had cast their cloaks of fire, and in the west one broad band of crimson and of gold held back the banners of the approaching night. From St. Antonia's steeple came the chiming of the hour, slow, solemn tones that filled the silence with mysterious eddies of lingering sound. Madge Ellison was still leaning over Betty's chair, her hands touching her friend's face. "Try not to brood too much on it, dear. I know I am not much of a woman to give advice. You might say that I had no experience." "And I too much. Listen," and she straightened in her chair. "Can't you hear people shouting?" "Shouting?" "As though there were a fire. It seems to come from Castle Gate." They were both silent, listening, and looking towards the open window. Vague, scattered cries rose from the shadowiness of the darkening town. They seemed to be drawing from Castle Gate towards the square, a low flux of sound that rose and fell like the cadence of the sea upon a shore at night. Betty sank back in her chair with a glimmer of impatience on her face. "Of course, I remember." From under the arch of the old gatehouse a crowd of small boys came scattering into the far corner of the square. A number of men followed, lined along a couple of stout ropes. They were dragging a carriage over the grey cobbles and under the dark elms in the direction of Lombard Street. Madge Ellison drew back from the window. Not so Betty. She rose from her chair and stood looking down upon those rough men of the Roxton lanes, who were shouting and waving caps with the unsophisticated and exhilarating zest of children. The carriage, with its plebeian team, passed under Betty's window. In it were a man and a woman, the woman holding a boy upon her knees. Whether some subtle thought-wave passed between those two or not, It happened that Catherine looked up and saw the face at the open window overhead. It seemed to her, in the hurly-burly of this little triumph, that the face above looked down at her out of a gloom of loneliness and humiliation. A sudden cry of womanly pity sounded in her heart. Catherine's arms tightened unconsciously about her boy, and her eyes, that had been smiling, grew thoughtful and very sad. The carriage rounded the corner and disappeared into Lombard Street, with a small crowd of men, women, and children following in its wake. Betty Steele turned from the window with a laugh. "It reminds one of a political demonstration." Madge Ellison had picked up the letter that the wife had left forgotten on the floor. "Shall I shut the window, Betty?" "No, it amuses me. Cela va sans dire." The men at the ropes had trundled the carriage down Lombard Street, and brought to before the great house opposite the cypress trees in Porteus Carmagee's garden. They were very hot and very happy, these Roxton workers, with Mr. William Baines, a stentorian choragus to the crew. A child threw a bunch of flowers into Catherine's lap. "Hooray! 3 cheers for the doctor! Hooray! Hooray! Hooray!" End of chapter 41. End of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. Read by Lynn Thompson.